The man tied himself to his horse and rode east into a wind that turned snow into sand. He had lost the fence line twice. Ice sealed his nostrils shut every 100 yards. At the 5th mile, the horse planted its hooves and refused to move, and he continued on foot, crawling the last stretch through thigh-deep drifts toward a cabin with no smoke rising from its chimney. He carried a wool blanket across his shoulders. It was not for warmth. He kicked the door open, and the air that hit his face smelled like bread. The coffin rode in the back of Martin's own wheat wagon, and the wagon's left rear wheel screamed against a cracked hub the entire 12 miles from town. Ada Lenore Voss sat on the bench seat with the reins loose in her right hand because her left wrist, damaged 2 years earlier when this same wagon had overturned on a rutted creek crossing, could not grip leather in the cold. Sleet struck the pine lid behind her in bursts that sounded like handfuls of thrown gravel. She did not look back. She had looked at Martin's face for the last time in the undertaker's back room, where the bill had taken 6 of her remaining $15, and the minister had taken another 2, and what was left of her husband lay beneath cheap boards that smelled of green sap, because the lumberyard had run out of seasoned stock 3 weeks into November. She reached the claim as the sky went the color of old pewter. 160 acres of open tableland 12 miles northwest of Miller, Dakota Territory. The cabin stood 14 by 18 feet, board-sided, clay-chinked, with a sod bank pushed against the north wall that Martin had meant to extend before the first freeze. He had not finished. The south-facing window held a single pane of glass beside a shuttered opening stuffed with rags and straw. 4 hens scratched in the lee of the woodpile. The woodpile itself was the first thing that would have told any passing neighbor the truth about Ada's situation. It held less than 3/4 of a cord of split cottonwood, a heap of twisted haysticks, and a bundle of dried sunflower stalks tied with baling wire. In a country where 6 to 8 cords could barely see a family through a hard winter, that pile was a death sentence. Ada unhitched the horse, led it into the sod lean-to that served as a stable, and broke ice from the water trough with the back of a hatchet. Her fingers shook. She had not eaten since a piece of bread at the undertaker's. Inside the cabin, she found what she had left that morning: 42 pounds of flour in a barrel, a sack of dried beans, a side of salt pork hanging from a roof beam, a tin of dried apples, and the iron cook stove that still had $16 owing on it to Orson Pike's store in Miller. She opened the stove door and laid kindling on the grate, struck a match. The fire caught, and for a moment the cabin held the small sound of wood ticking and snapping, and the sleet outside, and nothing else. Then she saw the crack. It ran from the left edge of the firebox upward in a jagged line the length of her hand. The iron on either side had darkened unevenly, the way metal does when it has been heated past tolerance too many times. A faint orange glow pulsed through the fracture. As the fire built, the glow widened. A curl of ash dropped through the gap and landed on the floor. Ada watched it fall. She did not move for several seconds. Then she grabbed the iron poker, raked the burning wood into the ash pan, shoveled the coals into the wash boiler, and dragged the boiler across the floor with her right hand while cradling her swollen left wrist against her ribs. Sparks scattered. One landed on her sleeve. She slapped it out, shoved the cabin door open with her hip, and hauled the boiler into the sleet. Steam rose from the coals and vanished into the gray air. She stood in the doorway, breathing hard, her sleeve singed, her wrist throbbing, and looked back at the stove. The crack was still glowing. Even without fuel, the residual heat in the iron kept the fracture visible, a thin, luminous wound in the side of the only heating device she owned. $9.80. That was what remained after the coffin. The minister, the freight fee for hauling Martin's body from the accident site, and the food she had purchased for the week. She owed Pike $31 at the store. She owed $16 on the stove that was now cracked beyond safe use. The nearest replacement stove sat in a warehouse in Huron, 60 miles east, and cost $28 before freight. She did not have $28. She did not have $18. She had $9.80, a wrist that could not grip a saw handle, and a pile of fuel that might last 18 days if burned carefully in a functioning stove, and perhaps 12 if burned in an open hearth where most of the heat would vanish up the chimney. Winter had not yet arrived in earnest. The deep cold, the killing cold, the cold that froze cattle standing upright and turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. That cold was still somewhere to the northwest, building over the high plains, and every farmer within 100 miles knew it was coming. They just did not know when. Ada could not leave. If she abandoned the claim, Pike would exercise his lien on the livestock and the stored wheat receipts, and her $31 debt would consume whatever sale value the property held. She would walk away with nothing, no land, no animals, no money, no husband, and no destination. She had no relatives in Dakota Territory. Her parents were dead. A sister in Wisconsin had 4 children and a husband who drank, and the last letter Ada had received from her, 6 months earlier, had asked to borrow money. She closed the cabin door. The sleet intensified. The stove sat in the middle of the room, cooling, cracked, useless. Ada dragged Martin's trunk against the flour barrel, wrapped herself in every blanket she owned, and lay down on the floor beside the only warm object left in the cabin, a row of hearth bricks that had absorbed heat from the morning's fire and now gave it back, faintly, through the soles of her boots. She did not sleep for a long time. 3 days later, Gideon Pratt's wagon appeared on the track that passed Ada's north fence line. He had not come for her. He was returning from a stove installation at a ranch 8 miles further west and had stopped, he said, because he saw no smoke from her chimney and wanted to confirm she had not already left for town. Pratt was 61 years old, lean as a fence rail, and had installed iron stoves and tin chimney systems across 3 counties for the better part of 20 years. He knew fire and metal the way a surgeon knows bone. He also knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had seen too many homesteads fail, that a widow with no money, no functioning stove, and less than a quart of fuel was not going to survive a Dakota winter on open prairie. He examined the crack without being asked. He ran his thumb along it, held a candle flame near the fracture with the stove cold, and shook his head before he spoke. "The iron is spent," Pratt said. "This is not a crack you patch. The whole left panel has been stress heated past the point where it holds shape. You weld it today, it opens tomorrow. You plate over it, the plate warps inside a week." He set the candle on the stovetop. "I have seen this in 3 other stoves this year. Cast iron from the eastern foundries has been getting thinner. They are cutting costs. The homesteaders pay the price." Ada asked what a replacement would cost. $28 for the stove, $4 freight from Huron, if the road stays open. He paused. "How much do you have?" $9.80. Pratt looked at the woodpile through the window. He looked at the 4 hens. He looked at the flour barrel and the hanging salt pork. "Mrs. Voss," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had delivered this verdict before. "You do not have enough fuel to heat this cabin with a good stove. You certainly do not have enough to heat it with an open fire. That wood and brush out there might last you 12 days if you burn carefully, and this cabin leaks heat through every joint. I chinked 100 houses like this. The clay shrinks. The boards warp. The wind finds every gap. He put his hat back on. You should move into town. Mrs. Aldrich takes boarders. Sell the livestock to Pike. Surrender the wheat receipts against your debt, and wait until spring to decide about the claim. If I leave, Ada said, Pike takes everything. I come back to nothing. If you stay, Pratt said, you freeze. And then Pike takes everything anyway and buries you beside your husband on the county's account. He did not say it with cruelty. That was the part Ada would remember. Gideon Pratt spoke the way a man speaks when he has weighed the numbers and found them fatal. He was not dismissing her. He was reading the arithmetic aloud. No box of dirt replaces cast iron, Pratt said at the door. Heat belongs in the stove, smoke belongs in the chimney, and a widow belongs somewhere she can be watched over. Ada thanked him for examining the stove and said nothing else. Pratt drove away. The wheel tracks froze into the mud before dark. That night, Ada built a shallow fire on the hearth bricks she had pulled together from the old stove base. She fed it twisted hay and brush, which flared hot and fast and filled the cabin with an orange pulse that lasted minutes before dying to coals. She fed it again. The chimney joint where the stovepipe had connected to the flue leaked a thin curl of smoke into the room. The cabin warmed briefly in the area nearest the fire. The far wall, 14 feet away, stayed cold enough that her breath fogged when she stood near it. Within an hour of the fire dying, the cabin temperature had dropped back to something close to the outside air. The chimney had pulled most of the heat upward and out. The hay and brush had burned too fast to build the kind of sustained coal bed that a proper stove could maintain. The little warmth that remained clung to the bricks beneath the ash. Ada cleaned the hearth area before sleeping. She stacked the warm bricks into a tight cluster, covered them with a folded horse blanket, and lay down beside them. Through the blanket, she felt the heat, not strong, but present, still there. The iron wash boiler she had used 2 nights earlier to haul coals outside sat near the door. She touched it, cold. The iron had surrendered its heat within an hour of the fire dying. The bricks had been away from flame for nearly 2 hours, and they were still warm. Ada pulled one free and held it. The weight of it, the stored warmth radiating through wool and into her palms, reminded her of something she had not thought about in years. Her mother's kitchen in La Crosse. Winter mornings before dawn. Her mother heating field stones on the cook stove and placing them beneath crocks of bread dough to keep the yeast alive while the house cooled overnight. The stones stayed warm long after the stove went cold. Her mother pressing Ada's small palm against the table beside the stones, not on them, beside them, and saying, "Feel that. Heat keeps moving after fire disappears. The stone remembers what the air forgets." Ada set the brick down. She did not have a functioning stove. She did not have money to buy one. She had less than 3/4 of a cord of split wood, a quantity of fast-burning brush and hay, and a cabin that lost heat through every wall as quickly as she could produce it. But she had bricks. She had stone. Martin's unfinished cellar wall held field stone he had collected from the creek terrace. She had clay for mortar. She had sand from the dry riverbed 3 miles south. And she had the memory of warm stone holding heat in its body long after the fire that warmed it had gone dark. The next morning, before feeding the hens, Ada set up a test. She placed an iron skillet filled with hot coals on a flat board. Beside it, she placed a clay crock packed with hot sand from the edge of her fire. Beside that, a single flat field stone she had heated by leaning it against the burning brush pile. She set a lump of tallow at equal distance from each and watched. The skillet radiated fierce heat. The tallow nearest it softened within minutes, but the iron cooled fast. Within 40 minutes, the skillet was merely warm to the touch, and the tallow had begun to firm again. The sand crock never reached the skillet's peak temperature. The tallow beside it softened slowly, much later. But 3 hours after the fire died, the sand crock was still warm enough to feel through a folded cloth. The tallow beside it remained soft. The flat stone fell between the two. Warmer than the sand, initially cooler than the iron, it held heat longer than the skillet, but surrendered it faster than the packed sand. Ada crouched beside the three objects and thought about Pratt's arithmetic. His numbers were correct. She did not have enough fuel to keep a fire burning continuously through a severe winter. Every armful of brush she burned gave her minutes of heat, and most of that heat went up the chimney. The fire was generous to the sky and miserly to the room. But what if the fire did not need to burn continuously? What if she could build something that caught the heat from a short, hot fire and held it the way the sand held it, slowly releasing warmth over hours instead of minutes? She would still need to burn fuel, but the same 28 pounds of brush that gave her 30 minutes of radiant heat from an open fire might give her several hours of warmth if that heat was trapped in mass instead of lost to draft. The resource she lacked was not firewood alone. It was the number of hours each armful could remain inside the cabin as useful warmth. She found a piece of brown paper in Martin's desk and a pencil stub. She sketched a low platform against the south interior wall, 6 feet by 8 feet. Not high, perhaps knee height. A timber frame on the outside. Stone footing carried down to packed earth. Inside, a firebox built of salvaged brick. A horizontal flue channel running beneath flat stone slabs. Dry sand packed around and above the channel. A clay-plastered surface on top. A chimney rising from the far end, steep enough to pull the smoke through the mass before the gases cooled and stalled. The idea was not to build a stove. It was to build a bed that remembered fire. She stared at the sketch and felt the first clean thing she had felt since Martin's funeral, the sensation of a problem that might have a solution. It was not hope. It was something colder and more specific. It was the recognition that the physics might work, even if nothing else did. Then she started listing what could go wrong, and the list was long enough to fill the back of the paper. Warren Vale arrived 4 days later, riding east from his ranch 6.5 miles away, following a yearling heifer that had broken through his fence line during a thaw. He found the heifer standing in Ada's empty hay corral, licking frost from a post. He found Ada on her knees beside the cabin's south wall, using a hand drill to bore holes in a plank she had marked with pencil lines. Warren was 34, a widower of 4 years, and known across the district for 2 things: the quality of his horses and his habit of crossing bad weather to check on isolated neighbors. He did not talk much. He did not need to. He had the kind of face that registered judgment before he chose to speak, and Ada saw his judgment the moment he looked at the sketch she had tacked to the cabin wall. "How much does that weigh?" Warren asked. "I have not calculated the full weight. The sand alone will be close to a ton. With stone and brick, perhaps 3,000 pounds total. Your floor joists are cottonwood, undersized cottonwood from the look of them. You put 3,000 pounds on those joists and you will be heating the crawl space. I am not putting it on the joists. I am cutting through the floor and building the foundation on packed earth, independent stone piers." Warren looked at her. Then he looked at the sketch again. "The flue," he said. "You have 12 feet of horizontal run before the chimney. That is too long. Smoke cools as it travels. By the time it reaches the vertical rise, the gases will be too cold to draft properly. The smoke slows, the chimney stalls, and everything backs up into the firebox. I can keep the chimney rise short and steep, and I can preheat the chimney with burning straw before the main firing." And if the wind comes out of the northwest at 40 miles an hour and pushes straight down the chimney, your preheated draft means nothing against a sustained downgust. Ada said nothing for a moment. Then I add a controlled air inlet near the firebox. If wind pushes down the chimney, fresh air entering low will feed the draft from below. Warren tied his heifer to the fence post. You are spending your last week of mild weather building something no one here knows how to repair, he said. If this fails, you will have torn apart your only hearth, spent your last money on rivets and pipe, and you will be worse off than you are right now. I know, Ada said. Then why? Because even an imperfect version of this will stretch fast-burning brush further than an open hearth. I do not need it to make the cabin warm. I need it to keep the cabin above freezing longer between fires. Every additional hour I gain is an hour I am not burning fuel I do not have. Warren studied the sketch one more time. He did not offer to help. He did not offer money or wood or advice. He untied the heifer, mounted his horse, and said, "If you change the flue path and it backdrafts, open every window before you try to relight. Carbon monoxide does not smell like anything. You will not know it is killing you." He rode west with the heifer. Ada returned to the plank. Her wrist ached where she gripped the drill. The pencil lines blurred slightly because her eyes were wet from the wind or from something else, and she wiped her face on her sleeve and kept boring holes. She rode to Miller the following morning. Pike's store sat at the center of town, a false-fronted frame building with a loading dock and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Pike General Merchandise, Credit Extended." Orson Pike himself stood behind the counter, 46 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with a ledger book open beside the register and a pencil behind his ear. He had held liens on more homesteads than anyone in the district. When claims failed, and in Hand County in the late 1880s, claims failed regularly, Pike acquired the property, the livestock, and the stored grain at fractions of their worth. He was not a villain in the storybook sense. He was something more durable, a man who had organized his entire livelihood around the likelihood that other people would not survive. Ada placed her $9 on the counter and asked for stovepipe rivets, lamp oil, and 2 pounds of salt. Pike looked at the money. He looked at Ada. He opened his ledger and turned to her page. "Your account shows $31 outstanding," he said, "plus 16 on the stove. That is $47, Mrs. Voss." "I am aware of the amount." "And you are spending $9 on rivets and lamp oil." He closed the ledger slowly. "May I ask what you intend to do with stovepipe rivets when your stove is cracked through the firebox?" "You may ask. I would rather not explain." Gideon Pratt was in the store. He had come for solder and tin sheeting. He heard the exchange and stepped closer. "I examined that stove," Pratt said to Pike, though he was looking at Ada. "The iron is finished. She cannot use it for heating." "Then what are the rivets for?" Pike asked. Pratt looked at Ada. "Mrs. Voss?" Ada picked up the rivets, the lamp oil, and the salt. "I am building a masonry platform with a flue channel that passes through sand and stone. The rivets are for joining salvage stovepipe to create the horizontal run. The lamp oil is so I can see what I am doing after dark." The silence in the store lasted long enough for Ada to count 3 heartbeats. Pratt spoke first. "A heated sand bed." "A heated masonry platform with sand as thermal fill." Pratt set down his solder. He folded his arms. 2 other customers, a wheat farmer named Aldrich and his teenage son, had stopped examining harness leather and were listening. "She's building herself a coffin," Pratt said, "and paying extra to warm it." The laughter was not loud. It was the uneasy kind, the laughter of people who recognized that the joke was also a diagnosis. A widow with $9, a cracked stove, and less than a quart of fuel, was now proposing to fill her cabin with 3,000 pounds of sand and stone and run hot smoke beneath it while she slept. Ada did not argue. She put her change in her coat pocket, gathered her purchases, and walked out. Behind her, Pike said something she did not hear, and someone laughed again, and the door closed. On the loading dock, Ada's hands were shaking. Not from cold, from the specific, clarifying anger of being laughed at by people who had already decided she was dead. She loaded the wagon and drove north. Pike moved quickly. Within 2 days, 3 things happened. He told the freight teamster who worked the Miller-Huron Road that Ada's credit was suspended and any goods delivered to her claim would not be guaranteed against her account. He visited the blacksmith, a quiet German named Esser, and reminded him that Pike held the lease on the shop building. Esser stopped offering to lend Ada a stone drill he had promised the week before, and he spread with the careful efficiency of a man who understood how information traveled in a small community 3 observations: that Ada Voss had become unstable since Martin's death and was behaving dangerously, that any fire damage to the homestead would not be covered because the insurer would view a homemade flue system as reckless modification, that anyone who helped Ada build her device might share liability when the cabin burned. The observations were not delivered as gossip. Pike stated them as business concerns in the measured tone of a man protecting the community's interests. That was what made them effective. He did not need people to hate Ada. He needed them to hesitate. Ada learned about the freight restriction when she tried to arrange transport for a load of sand from the river terrace. The teamster, a man named Drucker, apologized and said he could not risk the job. Warren rode to her place the following afternoon. He had heard about the store conversation from Aldrich's son, who had repeated Pratt's line to half the district in 24 hours. "I can haul sand with my team," Warren said. "The river terrace is on my way to the south pasture." Ada looked at his face and saw what she expected to find there: concern arranged as kindness, which was arranged as an offer of help, which was arranged at the very bottom as pity. "No," she said. "Mrs. Voss, I do not want your pity, Mr. Vale. I want a stone drill and a wagon harness that Pike has not confiscated." Warren left without the heifer, which had broken through his fence again and was standing in Ada's corral as if it had chosen a side. Ada hitched Martin's narrow farm wagon, which was slower and carried less than a proper freight wagon, and began hauling sand in smaller loads. Each round trip to the river terrace took most of a day. She could carry perhaps 400 pounds per load. She needed at least 3,000 pounds of sand alone, not counting stone and brick. The math was not encouraging, but the math for every alternative was worse. Each evening, she returned to the cabin, fed the hens, built a small brush fire on the hearth bricks, and worked on the platform foundation by lamplight. She had cut a section of floor. The boards came up with a sound like tearing cloth, the nails pulling free from joists that were already beginning to rot at their bearing points. Beneath the floor, she found packed earth, hard enough to support weight, but too shallow to undisturbed subsoil. She dug. The shovel handle punished her left wrist. She wrapped it in a flour sack strip and kept digging until she reached soil that had not been turned, then set the first broad field stones for Martin's unfinished cellar wall. The foundation would hold the platform independent of the cabin floor. Whatever happened above, the heat, the expansion, the weight, would bear on stone and earth, not on Martin's undersized cottonwood joists. She was placing the third foundation stone when she heard boots on the frozen ground outside. The man in the doorway was not Warren. He was not Pratt. He was not Pike. He was older than all of them, 58, perhaps 60, with a face that looked like it had been fired in a kiln itself. Deep seams ran from his cheekbones to his jaw. His hands were large and scarred across every knuckle. He wore a canvas coat patched at both elbows and carried nothing except a cloth bundle tied with twine. He looked at the hole in Ada's floor. He looked at the field stones. He looked at the thin line of clay mortar she had pressed between the first two stones. He crouched, pinched a piece of the mortar between his thumb and forefinger, and crushed it. The mortar crumbled into a dry, powdery debris that fell through his fingers like sand. "Too much topsoil," the man said. His accent was heavy, German by way of somewhere further east. "Rich earth shrinks when it dries, pulls away from the stone. Your joint will open before the first firing." Ada stared at him. "Who are you?" she asked. "Matvei Korda," he said. He did not explain further. He brushed the mortar dust from his fingers, looked at the crumbled remnants on the floor, and looked at Ada. "You're building a heated platform," he said. It was not a question. "I'm trying to. With this mortar, you are building a smoke leak." He picked up another fragment and held it to the lamplight. "See the color? Dark, organic. This is garden soil. It feeds plants. It does not hold fire." He set the fragment on the floor, straightened his knees slowly, the motion of a man whose joints carried decades of labor, and looked at the sketch on the wall. "Your flue path is reasonable," he said. "Your firebox is too close to the timber curb, and your chimney rise needs to be steeper, or the draft will stall in any crosswind." He paused. "But the principle is correct. Mass holds heat. A short fire charges the mass. The mass warms the room after the fire dies." He looked at Ada. "I worked railroad culverts and brick kilns for 11 years before my back broke. I know how hot gas moves through masonry. I know where it leaks and where it does not." He nodded at the crumbled mortar. "And I know that what you have mixed there will kill you in your sleep if you trust it to contain smoke." Ada felt her pulse in her wrist. "Can it be fixed?" she asked. Matvei pointed at the ground outside the cabin. "Subsoil. Dig past the roots, past the dark earth, down to the pale clay. Mix it with sharp sand and chopped dry grass. No topsoil, no manure. Nothing that burns or shrinks." "Will you show me?" Matvei studied her for a long moment. It was not the look Warren had given her, freighted with concern and the assumption that she needed rescue. It was the look of a craftsman evaluating a joint. "Make one," he said. "Mix the mortar yourself. Set one joint. Let it dry overnight. We'll come back tomorrow and break it. If the crack runs through the stone and not the mortar, it is worth helping." He picked up his cloth bundle and walked into the dark. Ada stood in the gutted cabin with a crumbled mortar joint at her feet and a revised formula in her head. She mixed the first batch before she slept. Pale subsoil clay, sharp river sand, dry grass chopped fine with a knife. It felt different in her hands, heavier, grittier, less forgiving. She pressed it between two stones and set it beside the hearth bricks to cure. Outside, the wind changed direction. It came from the northwest now, steady and dry, carrying the smell of distances Ada could not see. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the temperature was falling, and the air that would eventually reach her cabin was gathering weight and speed across hundreds of miles of open plain. She had no functioning stove. She had a foundation half built, a flue unstarted, a chimney unplanned. She had $9 minus the cost of rivets, lamp oil, and salt. She had a mortar joint drying beside a cooling row of bricks and a stranger's promise to return and break it. If the mortar held, she had a chance. If it crumbled again, she had nothing. The hens shifted on their roost. The wind pressed against the north wall. Ada wrapped her wrist in the flour sack strip, blew out the lamp, and lay down in the dark beside the warm bricks, waiting for morning. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who understood the old method but could not see what you were trying to build? Chunk 2 continues. Matvey returned at dawn. He did not knock. Ada heard his boots on the frozen ground and opened the door to find him already crouching beside the test joint she had left to cure near the hearth bricks. He held a short-handled mason's hammer, old, with a head worn smooth on one face and chipped on the other. He turned the joined stones in his hands, examined the mortar line from both sides, and struck it. The crack ran through the edge of the weaker stone. The mortar held. Matvey set the pieces down and looked at Ada. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. The expression of a man who had expected failure and found competence instead. "Now it is worth helping," he said. He did not offer to build the platform for her. He did not produce a plan or take command of the project. What he did that first morning was sit on Martin's trunk with Ada's sketch in his hands and point to every place where fire, smoke, or expansion would destroy what she had designed. The firebox was too close to the timber curb. Hot brick expands. Over repeated firings, the expanding masonry would push against the wooden frame, cracking joints and opening gaps where smoke could escape into the sleeping surface above. The firebox needed to sit on its own stone base with a finger-width gap between the hottest brick and any timber, packed loosely with po-white clay that could compress without cracking. The flue channels were drawn as a single narrow run. Narrow channels increased gas velocity but also increased the chance of blockage. A dead bird, a clump of creosote, a piece of fallen mortar, any obstruction in a narrow flue would stall the draft instantly. Two broader passes, side by side, with flat stone slab roofs, would move the same volume of hot gas with less risk. The chimney rise was too gradual. Smoke needed vertical pull to escape the horizontal mass. The final section had to climb steeply, nearly straight up, and the chimney base had to be close enough to the flue exit that the gases remained hot enough to rise. Ada listened. She did not argue with any of it. She asked one question. "How do you know where it leaks?" Matvey reached into his coat and produced a stub of candle. He lit it, held it near the test joint, and watched the flame. It bent, barely, toward a hairline gap where the mortar met the stone's irregular surface. "Fire tells you," he said. "Warm air moves toward cold. Cold air moves toward warm. A candle flame will always lean toward the draft. If you hold a flame beside a joint and it bends toward the masonry, air's being pulled inward. That means smoke can travel outward through the same path." He extinguished the candle. Every joint, every seam, every connection between materials. You test with flame before you fire with fuel. If the candle shows a leak when the system is cold, the smoke will find it when the system is hot. He paused. The second tool is a feather. Hold a down feather near a suspect joint after firing. The feather moves before your eye can see the smoke. And the third tool is your nose. Smoke in a room smells different from smoke in a chimney. If you're lying on the platform and the air smells wrong, the mortar has failed somewhere beneath you. Do not wait to see smoke. Open the firebox door and extinguish the fire. Then find the leak. Ada wrote nothing down. She repeated the 3 tests: candle, feather, nose, and Matvey nodded. That was his way. He did not lecture. He demonstrated a principle once, asked her to repeat it, and moved on. If she asked him to explain further, he would show her again with a different example. If she still did not understand, he would wait. He never repeated himself a third time with words. The third repetition always involved her hands on the material, making the mistake, discovering why the principle mattered through the sensation of mortar crumbling, or flame bending, or stone shifting under unequal heat. They began the foundation in earnest. Ada had already set 3 field stones in the excavated floor. Matvey examined each one, rejected the third because its bearing face was angled and would transfer weight unevenly, and showed Ada how to find the stable axis of an irregular stone by rocking it on a flat surface and marking where it settled. They pulled stones from Martin's unfinished cellar wall. The cellar had been Martin's winter project, a root storage space dug 3 feet into the earth behind the cabin, lined with fieldstone hauled from the creek terrace over 2 summers. Martin had collected far more stone than the cellar required. The surplus sat in a rough pile behind the stable, half buried in dead grass and frozen soil. Ada and Matvey pried them loose with an iron bar and rolled the heaviest ones on fence rails laid across the ground. The foundation required broad, flat-bottomed stones at each pier point, with smaller rubble packed between them and mortared with the subsoil mix. Matvey insisted on dry-fitting every stone before any mortar was applied. He placed each one, stood on it, shifted his weight, removed it, adjusted the bearing surface with a cold chisel, and placed it again. Ada's job was to mix mortar in a wooden trough, carry it to the joint, and press it into the gaps with a flat stick while Matvey held the stone in position. Her left wrist began to swell by the second day. The repetitive pressing motion, packing mortar into narrow joints, required exactly the kind of sustained grip her damaged wrist could not maintain. She wrapped it tighter. She switched to her right hand for the heaviest work. By the third day, her right palm had split along the base of the thumb. She wrapped it in a strip of flour sack and kept working. Matvey saw the blood on the cloth and said nothing. He did not offer sympathy or suggest she rest. He adjusted the work sequence so that the heaviest lifting fell during the first hours of the morning, when Ada's hands were least swollen, and shifted mortar work to the afternoon, when the joints were most visible in the angled light. It was a kindness disguised as efficiency, and Ada understood it as both. The foundation was complete after 6 days. Matvey tested each pier by dropping a heavy stone onto it from waist height. The impact sent vibrations through the packed earth, but nothing shifted. The firebox came next, and with it came the first material that had to be scavenged beyond Ada's property. 3 miles northwest, the remains of an abandoned creamery sat in a field that had changed hands twice since the original owner left for Oregon. The creamery's stone foundation still stood, but the wooden structure above it had collapsed inward during a windstorm 2 years earlier. Beneath the wreckage lay bricks, hundreds of them, smoke-blackened and mortar-crusted, but fired clay that had already survived heat. Ada and Matvey drove Martin's wagon to the site and spent a full day pulling bricks from the rubble. Matvey rejected more than half of them. He tapped each brick with his hammer, the mason's hammer he carried everywhere, the one with the worn face and the chipped peen. A clear, ringing tone meant sound brick. A dull thud meant internal fractures, invisible cracks where moisture had entered during freezing cycles and split the clay from within. A cracked brick in a firebox is worse than no brick, Matvey said. The crack becomes a channel. Heat enters the channel and reaches whatever is behind the brick. If that is wood, you have fire. If that is mortar, you have a leak. If that is sand, you have a hot spot that can crack the surface above. By the end of the day, they had 114 sound bricks, loaded on the wagon in stacked rows with hay between the layers to prevent chipping during the ride home. The wagon's axle groaned on the return trip. The cracked hub, the same hub that had screamed during Martin's funeral, ground against the iron sleeve, and Ada drove slowly, listening for the sound of failure. They built the firebox over 4 days. Matvey laid the first course and then stepped back and watched Ada lay the second. He corrected her twice, once for a mortar joint too thick, which would shrink and crack, and once for a brick set with its fractured face inward, which she had not noticed in lamplight. She pulled the brick, examined the fracture, replaced it with a sound one, and did not make the same mistake again. The firebox sat on its own stone base, separate from the platform foundation, with the finger-width expansion gap between the hottest surfaces and the timber curb. The loading door was the single most valuable piece of the dead stove, the left side plate, which had not cracked. Matvey cut it with a cold chisel, filed the edges, and mounted it on iron pins so it could be opened and closed to control airflow during firing. "Your stove was worthless as a stove," Matvey said, "but the iron is still good iron. Metal does not forget how to hold a shape just because a foundry made the walls too thin." Warren returned on the 9th day of construction. He did not arrive alone. Tied to his saddle were 2 pieces of limestone, each roughly 3 feet long, 6 inches thick, and flat enough to serve as lintels across the top of a flue channel. They were heavy. Warren's horse had labored under the extra weight for 6 miles. He untied the stones, set them on the ground beside Ada's cabin, and said, "Where do you want them?" Ada looked at the limestone. She looked at Warren. His face held none of the pity she had seen the last time. Something had changed in the interval. Perhaps the story of her work had reached him through Aldrich or one of the other neighbors. Perhaps he had simply thought about what she had said, or perhaps the sight of the foundation and the firebox, visible through the open cabin door, had replaced his image of a desperate widow with something closer to a builder. "The flue channel roof," Ada said. "But I need to set the sidewalls first. Can you leave them?" "I can help you set the sidewalls." Ada hesitated. Then she looked at Matvey, who was sitting on a stump retying his boot, and who said nothing but gave a nod so small it could have been a muscle twitch. "The south channel first," Ada said. "Matvey, can you check the mortar on the firebox base while we move the sidewall slabs?" It was the first time she directed both men. The shift was quiet, but unmistakable. Warren carried where Ada pointed. Matvey observed and corrected. Ada decided. The flue took 5 more days. 2 broad passes ran side by side through the platform's core, each roughly 6 inches high and 10 inches wide, roofed with the flat-field stone slabs and Warren's limestone lintels. The channels met at the far end of the platform and merged into a single vertical rise quay. The chimney, which exited through a hole Ada cut in the cabin's south wall and rose along the exterior, steep and straight, held to the wall with iron brackets salvaged from Martin's stable. Matvey tested the draft with a candle the moment the chimney was complete. He lit the stub, held it at the firebox opening, and watched. The flame bent inward, pulled toward the firebox by the chimney's draw. Air was moving through the system, flowing in through the loading door, across the firebox floor, into the flue channels, through the 12 feet of horizontal mass, up the vertical rise, and out the chimney cap. Then Warren opened the cabin door. The flame wavered. It leaned back toward the room, away from the firebox. The draft had reversed. Cold air entering through the open door had disrupted the pressure balance, and the chimney's pull was not strong enough to overcome the new airflow. Matvey looked at Ada. Ada had already moved. She knelt beside the firebox and examined the air inlet she had built into the base. A small iron grate set low in the foundation, designed to feed combustion air from beneath the cabin floor. The grate was closed. She opened it. Cold air rushed through the subfloor space, entered the firebox from below, and restored the upward pull. The candle flame bent inward again, stronger now, fed by the dedicated air supply rather than relying on whatever air leaked through the cabin's walls and door. In a storm, Warren said, that door will not be open, but the wind pressure against the chimney could produce the same reversal. The inlet compensates, Butta said. If the wind pushes down the chimney, the inlet feeds the fire from below, and the rising heat forces the column back upward. The fire has to be burning for it to work. If the fire dies and the wind pushes down, yes, the draft reverses. That is why I cannot let the fire die during a storm. Warren looked at Matvey. Matvey said, she is correct. The system requires an active fire to maintain draft under wind pressure. A dead fire with an open flue in a storm is a smoke channel into the room. He paused. But she does not need a continuous fire. She needs a fire hot enough to establish draft, maintained long enough to charge the mass, and then closed properly. The mass holds the heat. The draft holds as long as the chimney is warmer than the outside air. Once the chimney cools, the flue damper closes, and the system is sealed. He looked at Ada. Show him the damper. Ada pulled a flat piece of iron, another salvaged piece from the dead stove, from a slot she had built into the chimney base. When inserted, it sealed the flue exit. When removed, the gases flowed freely. Fire, charge, seal, Matvey said. That is the cycle. Each firing heats the mass. The mass radiates for hours. When the mass cools below useful temperature, you fire again. Between firings, the damper stays closed and the system holds whatever heat remains. Warren touched the limestone lintel. It was cold. Everything was cold. The system had not yet been fired with real fuel. I will believe it when I feel it, he said. The thermal fill nearly destroyed the schedule. Ada needed the sand dry, thoroughly dry. Matvey had been explicit on the first day. Moisture trapped in sand beneath hot masonry would turn to steam. Steam expanded. Expansion cracked mortar joints. Cracked joints leaked smoke. Smoke beneath a sleeping surface killed the person sleeping on it. The sequence was absolute. Every grain of sand that entered the platform had to be dry enough that it flowed freely through Ada's fingers without clumping. She tested each load by squeezing a fistful. If it held shape, it was too wet. If it crumbled and ran, it was ready. She collected the sand from a dry river terrace 3 miles south, a raised bank where the soil was naturally sandy and had remained above the waterline through the autumn. She shoveled it into iron pans and canvas sheets and spread it in thin layers inside the stable, where the body heat of the horse and the dry air circulated by the open south wall could pull moisture from the grains over 2 to 3 days. The first 4 loads dried properly. The 5th load was spread on canvas behind the cabin because the stable was full. That afternoon, a snow shower swept across the prairie. Brief, lasting less than an hour, but long enough to wet half the sand she had laid out. Ada stared at the wet canvas. 400 pounds of sand, damp and clumping, 3 days of hauling, shoveling, and spreading, wasted if she could not dry it again. She was tempted. The sand was only slightly wet. Perhaps it would dry inside the platform as the first firings heated the mass. Perhaps the moisture would simply evaporate through the clay surface. She looked at Matvey, who was standing in the stable doorway with his arms folded. If I use it wet, Ada said, what happens? In the best case, steam rises through the fill, finds the surface, and evaporates over several firings. The surface clay absorbs moisture and may crack. The cracks are cosmetic and can be patched. And in the worst case, steam finds the mortar joints around the flue channel. The expansion forces a seam open. Smoke enters the fill. You cannot see it, you cannot smell it until it reaches the surface in quantity, and by then the joint has been eroding for days. The next hard firing sends smoke through the platform into the room. Ada hauled the wet sand back to the stable and spread it in thin layers beside the dry loads. They lost 2 days. 11 days. That was Ada's private estimate of the time remaining before the cold turned lethal. She had no calendar for blizzards. Nobody did. But she had lived through 2 Dakota winters, and she knew the signs, the quality of the light changing, the wind shifting to a steady northwest draw, the cattle grouping tight against fences, the silence that fell over the prairie when birds stopped moving. The signs had not arrived yet, but they were closer every morning. Progress. Foundation complete. Firebox complete. Flue channels complete. Chimney complete and drawing. Sand fill roughly 2/3 loaded. Surface slabs not yet placed. Expansion joints not yet packed. Clay plaster not yet applied. Sleeping surface not yet tested. Fuel remaining. Approximately 500 pounds of split cottonwood, a diminishing supply of twisted hay, and brush she could gather from creek margins if the ground remained unfrozen. Money remaining. $3.15. Food. 31 pounds of flour, beans, salt pork growing thin on the beam, dried apples, and 4 hens still laying. She filled the platform's sand by lamplight, carrying iron pans from the stable and pouring them through a gap in the surface slabs she had not yet mortared. The sand hissed as it settled. It sounded like water. She paused to listen each time, making sure it was the sound of dry grains shifting and not the sound of moisture meeting warm residual stone. On the 14th day, Matvey taught Ada the last 3 skills she needed. The first was expansion joints, where hot masonry met cold timber, or where stone that expanded at one rate met brick that expanded at another. Matvey packed narrow seams with a soft clay mixture that could compress under pressure without cracking. He made Ada press her thumb into the seam. If the clay yielded, it would absorb expansion. If it resisted, it would crack and transmit force to the surrounding structure. Hot stone must be allowed to move independently of cold timber, Matvey said. If you lock them together, the stone wins. It will push the timber until something breaks, and the thing that breaks will be the joint you cannot see. The second skill was heat judgment. Matvey sprinkled a pinch of flour on a test slab that Ada had heated with a small brush fire. The flour browned slowly, evenly, over the course of a minute. No scorching, no blackening, just a gradual shift from white to golden. Baking warmth, Matvey said. If the flour blackens instantly, the surface is dangerously hot. Too hot for skin, too hot for bedding, hot enough to char wood if anything touches it. If the flour does not change at all, the surface has cooled below useful temperature and needs another firing. He dripped water from his fingertip onto the same slab. The droplets sat, shimmered, and evaporated slowly. If the water dances and spits, the stone is above boiling point. If it sits and dries, the stone is below. The surface you sleep beside should dry a water drop slowly, warm enough to radiate, not hot enough to burn. The third skill was clean-out discipline. Matvey showed Ada every bend and transition in the flue channel and confirmed that each one could be reached through a removable stone or an access port. Creosote builds where smoke changes direction, he said. Every angle in this system is a place where tar and ash will accumulate. If you do not clean them, the buildup narrows the channel, the draft slows, the smoke lingers. Lingering smoke deposits more creosote. Within a season, a neglected flue is a chimney fire waiting for a spark. He made Ada disassemble and reassemble 2 clean-out covers until she could do it in lamplight with one hand. You will be tired when you need to do this, he said. You will be cold, and you will want to sleep. The cleaning must happen anyway. The surface went on over 2 days. Flat stone slabs laid across the top of the sand fill, mortared at their edges with the subsoil mix. Then a 2-inch layer of sand and clay packed smooth. Then a final coat of clay plaster applied wet and left to dry. Matvey showed Ada how to build up the plaster in thin layers rather than one thick coat. A thick coat cracked as it dried. Thin layers bonded to the layer beneath and created a surface that could flex slightly under thermal stress without opening into fissures. When the surface was complete, Ada placed a removable wooden frame on top, slats of cottonwood that would hold a wool mattress above the warmest masonry. The mattress would never rest directly against the hottest surface. An inch of air between slats and stone would buffer the heat and prevent scorching. Matvey stood back and looked at the finished platform. It filled most of the south wall of the cabin, 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, knee height. It looked like a raised stone bed. The firebox sat at the west end, its iron loading door catching lamplight. The chimney rose outside the east wall. The surface was smooth, pale clay, still damp from the final plaster coat. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It looked exactly like what it was. 3,000 pounds of stone, brick, sand, and clay assembled by a widow, an aging mason, and a rancher's grudging contribution in a board cabin on the open Dakota prairie against a deadline that had no fixed date but grew closer every time the wind shifted. Matvey coughed. He had been coughing for 3 days, a dry, deep sound that came from somewhere below his throat. He turned away from Ada when it happened, pressing his fist against his mouth. She noticed, but said nothing. He was not a man who wanted his body discussed. "Do not fire it tonight," Matvey said. "The surface plaster needs 2 more days to cure. If you fire too soon, the steam from the wet clay will weaken the coat from inside." 2 days, Ada repeated. 2 days. Then a small test fire. Then a larger one. Then you will know. He picked up his hammer, wrapped it in its cloth, and put it inside his coat. "I have to go into town tomorrow," he said. "The physician." "Your cough?" "My cough is my business, Mrs. Voss. Your platform is yours. Do not fire it early." He walked into the dark. Ada listened to his boots on the frozen ground until the sound disappeared. Then she sat on the edge of the unfinished platform and placed her palm against the cold clay surface. It felt like touching a promise that had not yet been tested. 2 days passed. The plaster dried. The clay lightened in color as the moisture left, turning from dark gray to a pale, chalky tan. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ada lit the first test fire. She used Matvey's method. A twist of burning straw dropped into the firebox first, to warm the chimney base and establish upward pull. The candle flame at the loading door bent inward. Draft was active. Then she fed small pieces of dry brush, cottonwood twigs, sunflower stalks, a handful of twisted hay. The fire caught and built quickly. Within minutes, the firebox glowed, and the sound of combustion echoed faintly in the flue channels beneath the platform. She held the candle at every joint, every seam, every clean outport. No lean, no drift, no smoke. After 40 minutes, she closed the loading door and the damper. Then she waited. 1 hour after the fire died, the surface nearest the firebox was warm to the touch. Flour sprinkled on it did not change color. She dripped water. It sat and evaporated slowly. Warm, not hot. 2 hours. Still warm. The clay surface radiated a gentle, even heat that Ada could feel through her palm. The cabin's temperature near the platform had risen noticeably. The far wall remained cold. 4 hours. The surface was cooler, but still above room temperature. A water crock she had placed beside the platform remained liquid. A crock near the north wall had begun to develop a skin of ice. 6 hours. The surface was barely warm. The distinction between the platform zone and the rest of the cabin was fading, but it was still there, a faint warmth like the last memory of a held hand, detectable through the wool mattress. 8 hours. The surface matched the room. The test was over. Ada recorded nothing in writing. She recorded everything in her body. She knew what 28 pounds of dry fuel had purchased. 8 hours of decreasing warmth, enough to keep water liquid beside the platform, enough to take the killing edge off the cabin air, enough to make the difference between sleeping in a coat and sleeping under a blanket. It was not enough. Not for a blizzard, not for sustained sub-zero wind, but it was proof that the principle worked. Fire enters the mass. Mass holds the fire's warmth. Warmth radiates outward over hours instead of vanishing up the chimney in minutes. 2 days later, Pratt arrived. He had heard from Aldrich that Ada's chimney was drawing and the platform was complete. Professional pride or professional anxiety or some mixture drove him to inspect. He spent an hour examining the system. He tested the draft with his own candle. He opened both clean-out ports and looked inside with a lantern. He tapped the chimney brackets. He ran his hand along the surface and studied the clay. He found the evidence he was looking for when Ada performed a second test firing at his request. A thin seep of smoke curled from the lower clean-out joint, a gasket that had not fully seated against the stone. "There," Pratt said. "You see it. Smoke on the wrong side." "I see it," Ada said. "That joint will worsen under heat cycling. Each expansion opens it further. Within a dozen firings, that is not a seep. That is a leak. Then I will reset the gasket." "And what about the joint you cannot see? What about the 100 other points where mortar meets stone inside 3,000 pounds of fill? You cannot inspect what you cannot reach." Ada pulled the clean-out cover, examined the gasket, and found a piece of mortar debris wedging it open. She removed the debris, reseated the cover, and the seep stopped. Pratt watched. His face did not change. "A heater that requires this much watching will kill you the first night you grow tired," he said. Ada looked at him. "Then the test is whether I can make it require less watching, not whether your stove is the only answer." Pratt left without saying more, but he did not condemn the structure. He did not order her to tear it apart. He left, and the silence he left behind was not the silence of a man who had dismissed her. It was the silence of a man who was still calculating. The morning of January 12, 1888, began with a lie. The air was warm, absurdly, dangerously warm for midwinter Dakota. Snow softened on the cabin's south-facing roof and dripped from the eaves. Ada opened the door and felt air that belonged to late March, not early January. The sky was clear. The wind was calm. Children would walk to school that morning in light coats, and farmers would step outside without hats and remark that the winter had finally broken. The winter had not broken. The winter was loading a weapon. Ada fed the hens, checked the horse, and stood in the doorway watching the horizon. Something was wrong with the light. The sky to the northwest had a quality she could not name. Not clouds exactly, but a heaviness, a density, as though the air itself had thickened into something with weight. The horse stamped and turned its hindquarters toward the northwest wall of the stable. Ada went inside and closed the north shutter. By noon, the western horizon had changed color. A dark line had appeared where sky met earth, stretching from north to southwest in a wall so uniform it looked man-made. It did not move the way weather usually moved, drifting, building, dissipating. It advanced, steady and fast, like something rolling across the ground. The temperature began to fall. Ada lit the firebox at 12:30. She used the straw warming technique, a twist of burning hay pushed into the chimney base to start the draw, then fed dry brush and the best cottonwood splits she had left. The fire caught hard and hot. She could hear the draft pulling, the low roar of air feeding combustion through the inlet grate. The chimney smoked cleanly. The flue channels ticked as the stone absorbed heat and began to expand. By 1 o'clock, the dark wall had swallowed the horizon. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 40 minutes. Wind arrived, not gradually, not in gusts, but all at once, as though someone had opened a door between the cabin and the Arctic. The blizzard struck the cabin's north wall with a sound Ada would remember for the rest of her life. It was not the sound of wind. It was the sound of weight. Millions of ice crystals driven horizontally at speeds that turned snow into something closer to sand, scouring the boards and forcing powder through every gap in the clay chinking. Within minutes, Ada could not see the stable from the window. The world beyond the glass had turned white. Not the white of falling snow, but the white of a solid wall, as though someone had pressed a sheet against the pane. The chimney screamed. Wind hit the cap and forced a column of air downward through the flue. Smoke burst from the loading door, filling the cabin with a choking gray haze. Ada dropped to her knees. The air near the floor was clearer. She crawled to the firebox, felt for the loading door with her right hand, and closed it. Then she opened the air inlet grate fully, grabbed a twist of straw from the pile beside the hearth, lit it from the remaining coals, and shoved it upward into the chimney base through the clean-out port. The burning straw heated the air inside the chimney. Heated air rose. The column began to reverse. Smoke that had pooled against the ceiling swirled and began to move back toward the flue. Ada opened the loading door a crack, fed another handful of brush. The fire roared. The draft caught. Smoke poured upward through the channels and out the chimney, fighting the wind. The chimney won, barely, trembling at the balance point between internal heat and external pressure. Ada kept the inlet grate wide open and the fire burning hard, but the wind had already won its first battle. The cabin was full of haze, her eyes were streaming, and the temperature inside had dropped 15 degrees in the time the draft was reversed. She closed the loading door and sealed the damper. The fire continued burning on its remaining fuel, consuming air through the inlet alone, and the draft stabilized. She opened the front door a crack to ventilate the remaining smoke, and the wind tore the door from her hand. Snow exploded into the cabin. A horizontal blast of ice crystals covered the floor, the flour barrel, the mattress, Ada's face. She threw her body against the door. Her left wrist screamed. The wind pressure was enormous. 40 miles an hour or more against a door that swung inward. She braced her boots against the floor planks and pushed. The door closed. She dropped the iron bar into its brackets and stood there gasping, snow melting on her skin, her wrist radiating pain from elbow to fingertip. The fuel near the door was wet. Hay twists that had been dry an hour ago now dripped with melted snow. She moved them beside the platform to dry. But they would take hours to become usable. Her dry wood supply had just shrunk by a third. The first hour passed in managed crisis. Ada fired the platform a second time, using the driest splits she had left. The mass absorbed the heat. The surface nearest the firebox grew warm, then hot, too hot to touch with a bare hand. She sprinkled flour on the test spot. It browned in under a minute. She layered folded quilts over the hottest section and stayed near the cooler eastern edge, where the surface temperature was closer to what Matvey had called baking warmth. The cabin did not become warm. That was the truth Ada lived with for the next 12 hours. The platform created a zone, a region of tolerable air within a room that was otherwise bitterly cold. The window on the north wall frosted from the inside. Water in a pail beside the north wall developed ice. The ceiling nails collected frost crystals that glittered in the lamplight, but beside the platform, the air was different. Bread dough Ada had mixed that morning, set in a covered bowl on the platform's edge, began to rise. A wet rag draped over the warm surface, dried within an hour. Ada could remove her coat while sitting on the mattress, could feel the heat through the wool beneath her, could press her damaged wrist against the warm clay, and feel the ache recede as the heat soaked into tendon and bone. The platform was not defeating the storm. It was creating a pocket of survival inside a building that was otherwise losing the fight. Then one of the hens was gone. Ada counted 3 in the cabin. She had brought them inside when the first gusts hit, knowing the stable was too exposed. 3 hens huddled beside the flour barrel. The 4th had been outside when the door blew open. It was somewhere in the storm. It was dead. The loss of the hen was small. 1 animal, 1 egg a day. But Ada stood at the door and stared at the iron bar and its brackets, and felt the weight of it. The weight of everything she could not control. The wind, the temperature, the hen, her wrist, Martin's death, the cracked stove, the money she did not have. She could build a platform and charge it with fire and close the damper and wait. She could not stop the storm. She could not stop the things that the storm took. She sat on the platform and pressed her palms flat against the warm clay and stayed there until her breathing slowed. 6 miles west, Warren Vale stood in his stable and watched his breath cloud in the lamplight. The storm had hit his ranch at approximately the same time it struck Ada's cabin. His buildings were sturdier, framed ranch structures with double-boarded walls and a functioning iron stove in the main house. He was not in danger. His animals were sheltered. His fuel supply was sufficient. But he could not see Ada's chimney smoke. He had looked west, correcting himself east, toward her claim twice during the first hour of the storm. The whiteout was total. No landmarks, no horizon, no distinction between ground and sky. The snow did not fall. It flew. Horizontal. Blinding. The kind of snow that filled a man's lungs if he breathed facing the wind. By nightfall, Warren had convinced himself that Ada's chimney had failed. The improvised platform, the salvaged stovepipe, the mortar joints mixed by a woman with a broken wrist, all of it had collapsed under the first real test, and Ada was freezing in a cabin full of smoke, or she was already unconscious from carbon monoxide, or she had tried to leave on foot and was lying in a drift somewhere between her claim and the road. He waited until morning. The storm did not weaken. If anything, the pre-dawn hours brought the deepest cold. The temperature fell below 30 degrees below zero, a level where exposed skin froze in minutes and breathing became a calculated act. At first light, which was not light at all but a faint lightening of the white from black-white to gray-white, Warren tied a rope to his saddle horn, looped the other end around his waist, pulled his scarf above his nose, and rode east. He followed fence posts. His own fence line ran 2 miles east to the section corner. Beyond that, he picked up a neighbor's wire and followed it south and east toward Ada's quarter section. The horse fought him. The wind hit the animal's right flank and tried to push them both off course. Ice formed around the horse's nostrils. Warren cleared it with his mitten every 100 yards. At the 3rd mile, he lost the fence. A drift had buried the posts and wire beneath 4 feet of compacted snow. Warren dismounted, swept his boot through the snow until he hit wire, and continued on foot, leading the horse. At the 4th mile, a hidden washout, a shallow drainage channel he knew in summer but could not see beneath the snow, dropped the ground beneath his left foot. He went down. The horse skidded and stopped. Warren's knee hit a rock beneath the snow, and for a moment the pain blotted out the cold. He got up. He kept walking. His hands had stopped aching, which meant the blood was retreating from his fingers. He curled them into fists inside his mittens and pressed them against his body. At the 5th mile, the horse stopped. It would not continue. The wind was directly in its face now, and the animal planted its hooves and refused to move. Warren pulled. The horse pulled back. He tied it to a fence post he found by feel and continued on foot. He crawled the final 100 yards. The snow was thigh-deep in the drifts between Ada's fence line and the cabin. The cabin itself was barely visible, a dark shape in the whiteout, its north wall completely buried in packed snow. The south wall was scoured clean. The chimney rose above the roofline, and Warren looked for smoke. He saw nothing. Wind tore across the chimney cap in horizontal sheets, and any smoke that emerged was flattened and dispersed before it rose a foot. He carried a wool blanket across his shoulders. He had brought it to wrap Ada's body. He reached the door. Snow had packed around the latch and frozen it. His mitten stuck to the iron. He pulled it free, leaving wool fibers on the metal, and hammered the latch with the heel of his hand. The door groaned against packed snow. He pushed it open. Warm air. The sensation was so unexpected that Warren stood in the doorway for 2 full seconds without moving. Warm air flowing outward around his body, carrying a smell he could not process. Yeast, clay, burning tallow, and something sweeter beneath it. Bread, rising bread. Inside, he saw Ada. She was seated on the raised platform, wrapped in a quilt, with a covered iron pot nested in a warm stone recess at the platform's eastern end. Frost lined the ceiling nails. Ice had formed on the north wall. The window pane was opaque with frozen condensation, but the air around the platform, a radius of perhaps 5 feet, was warm. Visibly, tangibly warm. Wet mittens hung from a cord above the platform edge, steaming gently as they dried. Ada looked at Warren. She looked at the blanket. She understood what the blanket was for. She stood, took it from his shoulders, and wrapped it around him. "Sit down," she said. Not on the platform, beside it. His fingers were white. She could see the bloodless patches across both hands where the cold had driven circulation inward. His beard was crusted with ice that cracked as his jaw moved. "How?" Warren said. "Sit down," Ada said again. "I will explain when your hands are warm. If you are invested in Ada's fight, subscribe and stay with us, because the heater is warm, the storm is still rising, and the chimney has already come apart once." She removed his outer coat. It was frozen stiff enough to stand upright when she set it beside the door. She peeled his mittens off, examined his fingers, white on the tips, mottled purple at the knuckles, and wrapped them in a dry wool cloth. She did not rub them. She did not place them on the hot surface. She brought a crock of warm broth from the platform recess and held it where he could cup his hands around it without gripping. "Do not hold it tight," she said. "Let the warmth come in slowly. If you force blood back into the fingers too fast, the tissue tears." Warren looked at her. His eyes were red-rimmed and streaming from the transition between sub-zero wind and warm air. He looked at the platform, the firebox, the chimney rising through the wall, the iron loading door fashioned from the dead stove's side plate. "Pratt said this would kill you," he whispered. "Pratt said it would kill me if built carelessly." "Is it built carefully?" Ada looked at the platform. At the mortar joints she had mixed from subsoil and sharp sand. At the expansion seams Matvey had taught her to pack. At the clean-out ports and the damper and the inlet grate and the candle stub she kept on a ledge beside the firebox for testing draft. "Ask me again in the morning," she said. The hairline crack appeared at 11 o'clock that night. Ada saw it in lamplight, a thin line in the clay plaster near the chimney rise, where the hottest gases made their final turn from horizontal to vertical. The crack was no wider than a thread. It ran diagonally across the plaster for about 4 inches. She held a feather beside it. The feather did not move. No smoke, no draft. But the crack was new, and it had not been there before the second firing. She watched it for an hour. During that hour, the storm hammered the north wall so hard that ice crystals sprayed through the chinking and collected on the floor. The temperature outside had reached its nadir, well below 30 degrees below zero, possibly below 40, with wind chill. Inside the platform zone, the air remained above freezing, but the contrast between the superheated flue core and the frozen exterior was producing stresses in the masonry that Ada could not control. At midnight, the crack widened. She could see it now without lamplight, a dark line against the pale clay. She did what Matvey had taught her. She did not smear clay over the surface to hide the crack. She scraped it open with a knife, widening the gap until she could see the layer beneath. The sand clay undercoat was intact. The crack was in the finish plaster only. The topmost layer, which had dried fastest and absorbed the most thermal stress. She mixed a small batch of ash-rich mortar, the same subsoil formula, but with fine ash added for heat resistance, and packed the gap. Then she reduced the next firing, less fuel, lower temperature, less stress on the masonry. The trade-off was immediate. Lower firing meant less heat stored. Less heat stored meant the platform cooled faster. The platform cooled faster meant the interval between firing shortened. Shorter intervals meant more fuel consumed. She was burning through her reserves faster than the platform was designed to require. The crack had cost her efficiency at the exact moment the storm demanded every degree she could produce. Warren lay on the mattress beside the platform, semi-conscious. She had moved him there after his hands regained color. His breathing was shallow but steady. His core temperature was rising, but slowly, too slowly for Ada's comfort. He needed sustained warmth for hours, not the declining curve of a single firing. She calculated. 150 pounds of dry split wood remained, perhaps 60 pounds of brush dry enough to burn cleanly. The wet hay from the door incident was drying on the floor beside the platform, but would not be ready until morning. 3 more firings until dawn. Each firing required approximately 20 to 30 pounds of fuel for a 90-minute burn. 3 firings at 25 pounds each, 75 pounds. That left 135 pounds for the following day. If the storm broke by midday, she could survive. If the storm continued into a second night, she would run out of fuel before morning. She fired the 3rd time at 2 in the morning. The wood was the last of her split cottonwood. She watched it burn through the loading door's cracked edge, the orange light pulsing in the dark cabin, the sound of combustion echoing faintly through the channels beneath the platform, the chimney drawing steadily against the wind. The crack in the plaster held. The ash mortar had sealed it. The platform's center rose to uncomfortable warmth. Ada checked the flour test. Fast browning. She layered the quilts and moved Warren further from the hottest zone. At 4 in the morning, the wind changed. It had been driving from the northwest for 14 hours. Now it swung west, and the shift in pressure did something to the chimney draft that Ada felt before she heard. The draw weakened. The fire, burning low on its remaining coals, stopped roaring and began to murmur. A faint haze appeared in the air near the ceiling, the chimney cap. Snow had been packing against the western side for hours, and the wind shift had pushed a crust of ice across the opening. The cap was partially blocked. Ada could not climb the roof. The wind would throw her off, and even if she reached the chimney, her damaged wrist could not grip tools at that angle in the dark. She found a hammer, not Matvey's mason's hammer, which he had taken with him, but a claw hammer from Martin's toolbox. She tied it to a length of rope, stood beneath the chimney opening inside the cabin, and swung the hammer upward against the stovepipe. The impact rang through the cabin. Warren flinched on the mattress. Soot and ice fragments rained down through the clean-out port. Ada swung again. The pipe shuddered. She heard something crack above. Ice breaking loose from the cap. The draft surged. The fire roared back to life. Smoke cleared, but the impact had loosened the collar where the stovepipe joined the chimney rise. A thin curl of smoke seeped from the upper joint, visible in lamplight curling upward along the wall instead of staying inside the pipe. Ada stared at it. She had the last piece of stovepipe wire, a length of twisted iron meant for securing joints against thermal cycling. She climbed on Martin's trunk, reached the collar, and wrapped the wire around the joint, pulling it tight with pliers. The smoke seep stopped. The collar held, but the wire was the last she had. If the collar loosened again, she had nothing left to secure it. She climbed down. She sat on the platform edge beside Warren, who had opened his eyes and was watching her with an expression she could not read. She was breathing hard. Her wrist throbbed. Her hands were black with soot. The lamp was burning low on its final measure of oil. "You should rest," Warren said. "I cannot rest. The chimney needs watching." "I will watch it." "You can barely sit upright." "I can watch a pipe joint." Ada looked at him. His color was better. His voice was steadier. The sustained warmth of the platform had done its work. Hours of gentle, radiating heat, pulling his core temperature back from the edge of hypothermia. He was not well, but he was alive, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has misjudged. She handed him the lantern. "If smoke comes from that joint, wake me immediately." She lay down on the cooler end of the platform, pulled a quilt over her body, and closed her eyes. The warm clay pressed against her back through the wool mattress and the wooden slats. Beneath her, 3,000 pounds of stone and sand and brick held the ghost of 3 fires, releasing it degree by degree into the dark air of the cabin while the storm screamed against the walls. She slept. She woke to silence. Not true silence. The wind still moved, but it had dropped from a roar to a moan, and the change was so dramatic that Ada's body read it as quiet. Gray light filled the cabin through the south window. Warren sat upright on the platform edge with the lantern extinguished, watching the chimney joint. "No smoke," he said. Ada sat up. Her body ached in places she could not separate. Wrist, shoulders, back, the soles of her feet where she had braced against the floor during the night. She placed her palm on the platform surface. Warm, not hot. The flour test would show nothing, but warm still, more than 6 hours after the last fire. She looked at the bread dough she had set aside the previous morning. It had risen. The yeast was alive. The air around the platform had stayed warm enough, long enough for the organisms in the dough to continue their slow chemical work. Outside, the storm was breaking. The sky to the south showed a strip of pale blue. The drifts against the north wall reached the eaves. The stable was half buried, but the horse was alive. She could hear it stamping. Ada fired the platform one final time. She burned the last of her dry fuel. Martin's unfinished fence rails, the ones he had been splitting when the wagon overturned. The ones she had found stacked against the stable wall with his measuring mark still penciled on the bark. She broke them with a hatchet and fed them into the firebox and watched them catch. It was the only time she cried during the entire storm. Not when the stove cracked. Not when Pratt told her to leave. Not when the door blew open and the hen disappeared. But when she burned Martin's fence rails, the last physical evidence of the work he had planned and would never finish. She sat on the floor beside the firebox with the hatchet in her lap and wept until the fire settled into coals and the platform began to warm beneath her. Then she wiped her face, closed the damper, and made bread. At noon, the first rider appeared on the road, a neighbor from 3 miles south checking on survivors. He saw smoke rising from Ada's chimney and continued east. An hour later, Pratt's wagon appeared. He had come for Miller with a thermometer and a grim expression. He walked through the cabin without speaking. He opened both clean-out ports. He examined the chimney collar, the cracked and rewired joint, the patched plaster, the loading door. He placed the thermometer on the platform's surface and waited. Then he looked at the north wall, where frost still clung to the boards and a pail of water had frozen solid. He looked at the platform where Ada's bread dough sat in a covered bowl, risen and ready for baking, and where Warren Vale sat wrapped in wool blankets with color returning to his face. Pratt held the thermometer at arm's length and read it. He did not speak for a long time. Ada waited. Chunk 3 continues. Pratt read the thermometer a second time as though the first reading had been a mistake he could correct by repetition. He held the glass tube close to his face, tilted it toward the window light, and set it down on the platform's surface. The center reads 59 degrees, he said. The surface itself is warmer, perhaps 65, 68 at the firebox end. The north wall reads 21. He picked up the thermometer and walked to the far corner of the cabin, near the door. He held it there for a full minute. 26 at the door, 31 at the flour barrel. He returned to the platform. He placed his palm flat on the clay surface, the way Ada had done dozens of times during construction, and held it there. When was the last fire? 6 hours ago, Ada said. Approximately 90 minutes of burning, fence rails and brush. How much fuel? 30 pounds, perhaps 35. Pratt removed his hand. He opened the lower clean-out port and held his lantern inside. The flue channel was clean, soot on the walls, but no blockage, no fallen mortar, no obstruction. He closed it. He opened the upper clean-out port near the chimney rise and examined the joint that Ada had rewired during the night. The wire was tight. The collar showed no gap. He stood and looked at Ada the way he had looked at her in the store 3 weeks earlier, except that the calculation behind his eyes had changed. 3 weeks ago, Gideon Pratt had been weighing a widow's chances against the arithmetic of winter and finding them fatal. Now he was weighing the arithmetic of a system that should not have worked against the evidence that it had, and finding his original numbers incomplete. I was right that it could kill you if built carelessly, Pratt said. I was wrong that it could not be built safely. The admission cost him something. Ada could see it in the set of his jaw and the way his hand tightened on the thermometer. Gideon Pratt was not a man who revised his judgments lightly, and the revision he was making now, in front of Ada, in front of Warren, in front of the bread dough rising on the platform and the frost still clinging to the north wall, was not small. He was acknowledging that a 28-year-old widow with $9 and a broken wrist had built a heating system that kept 2 people alive through the worst blizzard in Dakota Territory's memory, using a fraction of the fuel his own stoves required. He did not say any of that. What he said was, "The collar needs a proper iron clamp, not bail-in wire. I will bring one tomorrow." He left. Ada stood in the doorway and watched his wagon move east toward Miller. The sky was clearing. The drifts lay in long, sculpted ridges across the prairie, and the wind that had nearly killed her 12 hours ago had dropped to a steady, cold breeze that smelled of nothing. No moisture, no warmth, no promise. Just cold, clean, empty air. She closed the door. She sat on the platform beside Warren and said nothing for a long time. The clay was warm beneath her. The validation did not arrive in a single moment. It accumulated over the following week the way the platform itself accumulated heat, slowly, from multiple sources, each one adding weight to the evidence until the total became difficult to dismiss. Ada recorded her fuel consumption for 7 consecutive days. She had no formal logs. She used a piece of brown paper tacked to the wall beside the firebox, and she marked each firing with a pencil stub. The time, the type of fuel, the approximate weight, and how long the surface remained warm to the touch after the damper closed. The pattern was consistent. One short morning, firing 15 to 20 pounds of brush and small wood, burning for approximately 60 to 70 minutes, raised the platform's surface to flour browning warmth and kept the zone beside it above 45 degrees for 4 to 5 hours. One stronger evening firing 25 to 35 pounds of the best wood she had, burning for 90 minutes to 2 hours, carried the platform through the night, holding the surface above skin comfort temperature for 6 to 7 hours before declining to barely warm by dawn. The total fuel consumed in a day ranged from 40 to 60 pounds. A conventional open hearth in the same cabin, burning continuously against the same wind and cold, would have required 2 to 3 times that weight and would have produced less consistent warmth, intense heat near the fire, cold everywhere else, and no residual warmth once the flame died. The platform did not make the cabin warm. It made the cabin survivable. The distinction mattered. Ada never claimed uniform comfort. She claimed hours of stored warmth per pound of fuel, hours during which the mass radiated what the fire had deposited, hours during which she could sleep or work or tend animals without feeding a flame. On the 5th day, the district school teacher, a woman named Lila Aldrich, wife of the wheat farmer, visited Ada's cabin with a specific request. She wanted to see the system, and she wanted to test it against a conventional stove. Lila placed 2 identical crocks of water in Ada's cabin, one beside the platform, one near the north wall. She placed 2 matching crocks in Pratt's shop in town, where an iron stove heated the workroom. Both fires were extinguished at the same hour. 4 hours later, Lila checked the crocks. In Pratt's shop, the crock near the stove was cool and the water had begun to chill. In Ada's cabin, the crock beside the platform was still warm to the touch. The crock near the north wall was cold in both locations. The test was crude. Lila was the first to say so. A single comparison, 2 different buildings, 2 different insulation levels, 2 different wind exposures. But the result matched what Ada's fuel record showed. The platform held heat longer, not hotter. Longer. The iron stove produced more intense warmth while burning, but the mass produced more durable warmth after the fire died. Lila asked Ada to explain the principle to a group of women who met weekly at the church for quilting. Ada agreed, but she set a condition. I will not explain it as a theory. I will show them the firebox, the channels, the cleanout ports, and the surface. They can put their hands on it. They can watch me fire it. If they understand by feeling, they will remember. If they understand by listening, they will forget. Pratt returned with the iron collar clamp, as promised. He also brought a proper cleanout door, a hinged iron plate, well fitted, that replaced the loose stone cover Ada had been using at the lower port. He installed both without charging her. Ada watched him work. He moved with the precision of a man who had fitted iron to brick 10,000 times, and the collar clamp seated perfectly on the first attempt. When he finished, he tested the draft with his own candle, tapped the chimney brackets, and pronounced the system tight. I would not build one of these in every house, Pratt said, standing at the door. The risk is real. A crack you miss, a clean out you neglect, a piece of wet fuel that drops the chimney temperature. Any of those send smoke where it should not go. An iron stove is simpler. Simpler means safer for most people. I agree, Ada said. Pratt looked at her, surprised. A stove is better for anyone who can afford one and has fuel to run it, Ada said. This is not a replacement for a stove. This is an answer for people who have no stove, not enough fuel, and no money to change either one. It stretches what they have. It does not replace what they need. Pratt nodded slowly. The nod carried more weight than anything he had said aloud. It was the nod of a professional acknowledging that a layperson had defined the limits of her own invention more precisely than he would have. He left. The following week, 3 families from the district appeared at Ada's cabin at separate times, each asking the same question. Could she show them how to build one? The first was a Swedish couple named Bergstrom, whose 2-room soddy had a functioning stove but insufficient fuel to run it through a second blizzard. They wanted a warming bench, a smaller version, something that could supplement the stove during extreme cold. The second was a young homesteader named Ko, 23 years old, who had arrived in Dakota Territory the previous spring with $40 and an axe. His cabin was smaller than Ada's. His stove was sound but undersized, and he had no more than half a cord of split wood and a large supply of twisted hay and prairie grass. The third was a woman named Hester Lund, a Norwegian widow in her 40s who lived on a quarter section 6 miles north of Miller. She had 3 children under 12 and a stove that drew poorly in high wind. She had heard about Ada's platform from Lila Aldrich and had walked 6 miles to see it. Ada showed all 3 the platform. She showed them the firebox, the flue channels, the clean-out ports, the expansion joints, the air inlet, the chimney rise. She let them touch the warm surface. She let them watch a firing. She answered every question, but she refused to let them build until they understood 3 things. First, the foundation must be independent of the cabin floor. Mass on joists collapsed the building. Mass on packed earth stayed where it belonged. Second, no wood inside the hot gas pathway, timber curbs, wooden frames, slat supports, all fine as external structures. But between the firebox and the chimney exit, the only materials touching hot gas must be stone, brick, clay, and sand. Any timber inside the fire zone was a house fire waiting for the mortar to fail. Third, every joint must be tested before the platform was used for sleeping, candle test, feather test, a full firing with someone watching every seam. If smoke appeared on the wrong side of any surface, the section was rebuilt before anyone slept beside it. She posted these requirements at the schoolhouse on a piece of brown paper she had asked Lila to display, and she drew a simple diagram showing the firebox, the flue path, the clean-out locations, and the chimney rise. It was not a blueprint. It was a set of principles. Each household would need to adapt the design to their own cabin, their own materials, their own stove situation. I am not giving you a plan, Ada told Hester Lund. I am giving you a set of rules. If you follow the rules, you can build anything that fits your house. If you break the rules, you can kill your children. Hester Lund looked at Ada for a long moment. Then she asked for a pencil and copied the diagram herself, line by line, asking a question at each step. Orson Pike heard about the schoolhouse posting within 2 days. He did not visit Ada's cabin. He did not need to. The information came to him the way information always came to Pike, through the store, where every farmer and rancher in the district eventually appeared to buy salt or flour or lamp oil, and where Pike stood behind his counter collecting debts and gossip with equal efficiency. What he heard disturbed him, not because Ada's design threatened his stove business. Pike did not sell stoves. Pratt did. What disturbed Pike was influence. Ada Voss, who 3 weeks earlier had been a widow he expected to default on her debt and abandon a claim he intended to acquire, was now a person to whom other settlers came for advice. She was teaching. She was drawing diagrams. She was setting conditions, telling people what they could and could not build in their own homes. Pike recognized authority when he saw it, because authority was the thing he had spent 20 years constructing for himself. Credit, liens, freight access, lease agreements. These were not just economic instruments. They were the architecture of influence. When Pike held a farmer's debt, he held a piece of that farmer's future. When Ada Voss posted a safety diagram at the schoolhouse and 3 families followed its principles, she was building a different kind of influence, one that did not require a ledger book. He moved carefully. He did not attack Ada directly. Instead, he spread a new set of observations through the store. First, Ada had not invented the heated platform. She had been taught by Matvei Korda, a foreign laborer with no credentials. The real skill belonged to Korda, not to the widow. Second, Ada was charging desperate families for her expertise. She was profiting from the blizzard sphere the same way a patent medicine vendor profited from disease. Third, the design was fundamentally unsafe, and Ada's posted safety rules were an admission that she knew it. A safe heater did not need a list of ways it could kill you. The second claim was false. Ada had not charged anyone. The third was a distortion. Every heating device required proper installation and maintenance, including Pratt's iron stoves. But the first claim was partially true. Matvei had taught Ada critical skills. Without his mortar formula, his draft testing method, his expansion joint technique, Ada's platform might have failed. The truth in the first claim gave weight to the lies in the other 2. Ada learned about Pike's campaign from Hester Lund, who had heard the talk at the store and walked 6 miles south to tell her. "He says you're selling what Korda taught you," Hester said. "I am not selling anything." "I know that. But Ko heard the talk and has not come back to finish his warming bench. He's afraid that if Pike turns against him, the freight costs for his spring supplies will increase." Ada understood the mechanism. Pike did not need to confront her. He needed to make the cost of associating with her high enough that people calculated differently. A farmer who angered Pike paid higher freight, waited longer for credit, and found his name mentioned in unfavorable contexts when land deals were discussed. The cost was never explicit. It was atmospheric. A chill in the air at the store counter. A pause before the pencil moved in the ledger. A wagon that arrived a week late. Ada's response was simple. She walked to the schoolhouse the following morning and wrote, in large letters beneath her diagram, "Free, no charge, no debt. Copy this yourself and build to the rules." Then she went to Pike's store. She placed her remaining money on the counter, $1.60, and asked for lamp oil. "Your account stands at $47, Mrs. Voss," Pike said. "I am aware. This is a cash purchase." "I could apply it to the balance." "You could, but then I would have no lamp oil and you would have $1.60 closer to 47. I prefer the oil." Pike filled the tin. He took the money. He did not look at her directly, but as she turned to leave, he said, "You understand that Korda is gone. When the next chimney cracks, who repairs it?" "I do," Ada said. "And when your repair fails?" "Then I learn why it failed and repair it again." "And when someone is hurt because you are learning on their chimney?" Ada stopped at the door. She did not turn around. "Mr. Pike, your warehouse lost every bottle and sealed container during the blizzard because your building has no thermal mass and your stove could not keep the interior above freezing. If you would like me to explain why, I am available. If you would prefer to replace broken inventory every winter, that is your choice." She left. The door closed. Behind her, the store was silent. Matvey returned to Ada's cabin 10 days after the blizzard. He looked worse. His face had thinned. The cough, which he had controlled during construction through sheer physical discipline, turning away, pressing his fist to his mouth, refusing to stop working, had deepened into something that bent him at the waist. He stood in the doorway and looked at the platform with the expression of a man reviewing work he was no longer certain he would live to see used. "The chimney collar," he said, noticing the new iron clamp. Pratt brought it. "Good. The wire would have failed within a month." He walked to the clean-out port, opened it, held his lantern inside. "Clean. You have been sweeping. Every 3 days. Every 5 is sufficient unless you burn wet fuel. Wet fuel produces more creosote." He closed the port. "How many families have asked?" "3 so far. I expect more after the next cold spell." Matvey sat on Martin's trunk. The act of sitting down, which for most people was unremarkable, carried visible relief. He had been standing on the walk from town, 12 miles, and his body had been arguing with his will the entire distance. "We should build a simpler version," he said. "Your platform is correct for your situation, a cabin with no stove and limited fuel. But most of the families who come to you will have functioning stoves. They do not need a replacement. They need a supplement." "A warming bench," Ada said. "Smaller, 3 feet by 6 feet, approximately 1,500 to 2,000 pounds. A shorter flue, 6 feet instead of 12. An exterior loading door where possible, so the firebox does not open into the living space. And a bypass from the existing stove exhaust, so the bench can be charged by routing hot gases through one short masonry pass before they reach the chimney. A stove heats the room and the bench at the same time." "Yes. The bench stores what the stove would otherwise send up the chimney. It does not replace the stove. It makes the stove more efficient." They disagreed about the fill material. Matvey wanted more stone. Solid field stone packed tight with minimal sand. Stone conducted heat faster and reached useful temperature sooner. A family coming in from a blizzard needed warmth now, not in 3 hours. Ada argued for sand. Sand distributed heat more evenly across the surface and reduced hot spots that could scorch bedding or burn skin. More importantly, sand allowed settlers to use imperfect rubble, stones of different sizes, irregular shapes, gaps, and voids, without creating air channels where smoke could bypass the intended flue path. The sand filled the gaps. It made imperfect masonry functional. "Your families will not have uniform field stone," Ada said. "They will have creek rubble, broken foundation blocks, old chimney brick, and whatever they can pull from the ground. If they pack that rubble tight and leave voids, hot gas finds the voids. If they pack it with dry sand, the sand seals the gaps." "Sand is a poor conductor," Matvey said. "It slows the heat. Your surface will be warm when you no longer need it and cold when you do." "I would rather have slow, even warmth than fast, uneven warmth with hot spots and cold spots. A hot spot on a bench where a child is sleeping is a burn. A warm spot is a comfort." They built 2 test boxes behind the cabin. Each was 2 feet square, 1 foot deep, with a small firebox and a 6-inch flue channel. One was filled with packed field stone. The other was filled with field stone rubble and dry sand. They fired both with identical fuel loads and measured the surface temperature at intervals using the flour test and the water drop test. The stone box reached browning temperature in 40 minutes. The sandbox reached it in nearly 90, but the stone box also cooled faster. After 4 hours, the stone surface was barely warm. The sand surface was still warm enough to dry a wet cloth laid on top. "Slower to warm," Ada said. "Slower to cool. For a family that fires the bench before bed and needs it warm until morning, the sand version is better. For a family that comes in frozen and needs warmth immediately, the stone version is better. Then we offer both. and we teach them when to choose which. Matvey looked at her. The look was complicated, pride and something else, something closer to grief. Not grief for Ada, grief for the work he was handing over. The mason's knowledge, accumulated through decades of kiln tending and culvert building and chimney repair, was passing from his hands to hers, and he could feel the transfer happening in real time, in this argument about sand and stone, in this woman who was no longer asking him what to do, but telling him what she had decided. He coughed, a deep, wet sound that shook his ribs. He turned away and pressed his fist to his mouth, and when he lowered his hand, Ada saw the red on his knuckles before he closed his fingers around it. She said nothing. He had told her his cough was his business. She honored that, even as the sight of blood on his hand changed the shape of every remaining day they had together. They built the simplified warming bench over 3 days, using the Bergstrom soddy as the first external installation. The Bergstroms had a functioning stove with a chimney that drew well. Matvey designed a bypass, a short horizontal run that diverted a portion of the stove's exhaust through a masonry channel beneath a 3 by 6 foot bench before returning the gases to the main chimney. The construction was straightforward. The Bergstroms provided labor and stone. Ada mixed mortar and supervised the joints. Matvey inspected every connection and tested the draft after completion. The bench worked. The Bergstroms reported that their evening fire, which had previously heated the room for 2 hours after extinguishing, now also warmed the bench for 4 to 5 hours beyond that. The children slept on the bench. The parents slept in beds nearby. The fuel consumption did not change, but the usable warmth extended further into the night. Coe returned the following week. He had calculated the cost of Pike's displeasure against the cost of another blizzard and decided that cold was more dangerous than expensive freight. Ada helped him build a sleeping platform similar to her own, scaled to his smaller cabin. His version used creek rubble and sand, with a firebox made from stones he had collected from a collapsed railroad culvert 3 miles east. Ada made him perform every draft test himself. She blocked the chimney deliberately during the first test firing, forcing smoke back through the system so that Coe could see what reversal looked like and smell what smoke in the living space smelled like. "If you ever smell that while lying on the platform," she said, "do not investigate. Open the firebox door, open the cabin door, and get out. Find the leak the next day when the system is cold and safe. What if it is 40 below outside? Then you get out fast and you come back fast, but you do not stay in a room filling with smoke because the alternative is cold. Cold hurts. Smoke kills." Hester Lund's installation was the most complex. Her cabin had 3 children, a poorly drawing stove, and a chimney that backdrafted in strong northwest wind, the same direction as every major storm. Matvey diagnosed the problem before entering the cabin. The chimney was too short. It did not extend far enough above the roofline to escape the turbulence zone created by wind hitting the roof slope. Extending the chimney solved the draft problem but created a new one. The taller chimney pulled harder, which cooled the flue gases faster, which increased creosote buildup. Matvey's solution was to insulate the upper chimney section with a double layer of stovepipe, one pipe inside another, with dry sand packed between them. The insulation kept the gases hot enough to rise without condensing tar on the pipe walls. "This is the part they will neglect," Matvey told Ada, while the Lunde children watched from the doorway. "The bypass, the bench, the firebox, these are visible. People maintain what they can see. The chimney insulation is invisible. In 2 years, the outer pipe will rust, the sand will settle, the creosote will build, and someone will have a chimney fire. Then I teach them to inspect the chimney annually." "You teach them, but will they do it?" "Some will, some will not. The ones who do not will learn from a chimney fire, or they will learn from a neighbor's chimney fire. I cannot make people careful. I can make them informed. Matvey gave her a look that was equal parts approval and resignation. The approval was for the clarity of her thinking. The resignation was for the truth she had stated. Information was necessary but not sufficient. People would be careless. Buildings would catch fire. The best she could do was reduce the number who were careless because they did not know better. 3 weeks after the blizzard, Matvey told Ada he was leaving. He did not frame it as a departure. He framed it as a trip. His niece in Yankton had invited him. The physician there was better than the one in Miller, and the railroad could take him most of the way. Ada knew he was not coming back. The cough had worsened to the point where he could not work a full day without sitting down twice. The blood on his fist had appeared 3 more times that she had noticed, and likely more times that she had not. A physician in Yankton might help, but Matvey was not going to Yankton for help. He was going to Yankton to die near family instead of dying in a boarding house in Miller. On his last morning, he gave her the mason's hammer. He held it out in both hands, the short handle, the worn face, the chipped peen, and Ada took it without ceremony because Matvey was not a man who wanted ceremony. He wanted the tool to go where it would be used. Do not teach them my design, Matvey said. Teach them how to notice when their own design is wrong. Ada held the hammer. It weighed less than 2 pounds. It felt like it held the weight of a life. The mortar formula, she said. You know it. The expansion joints. You know those too. The draft test. You can perform it in your sleep. He buttoned his coat. The one thing I did not teach you is when to refuse a job. If someone asks you to build a bench in a cabin that is too dangerous, rotten joists, no chimney, timber walls with no fire clearance, you must say no. They will hate you for it. They will say you are keeping knowledge from the poor, but a bench in a death trap is a faster death, not a slower one. He walked down the track toward the road. Ada stood in the doorway and watched until he was a small, dark figure against the white prairie, and then smaller, and then gone. She hung the mason's hammer on a nail beside her measuring cord and closed the door. The cabin was quiet. The platform ticked faintly as it cooled from the morning firing. A hen scratched at the floor near the flour barrel. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. Ada sat on the platform edge and pressed her palms flat against the warm clay. She stayed there until the warmth faded, and then she fired the box again because that was what Matvey had taught her. When the heat leaves, you put it back. You do not wait for the cold to remind you. You act before the need arrives. 5 weeks after the blizzard, the district schoolhouse caught fire. The cause was a chimney fire, exactly the kind Matvey had warned about. The school's iron stove fed a single-wall stovepipe that rose through the roof with minimal clearance from the wooden structure. Creosote had accumulated over years of burning green wood and wet fuel. On a February morning during a second extended cold spell, the teacher fired the stove hard to warm the room before 14 children arrived. A spark ignited the creosote buildup. The pipe glowed red from the inside, and within minutes, the ceiling timbers around the pipe penetration were burning. The teacher, a young man named Holm, who had replaced Lila Aldrich's husband for the winter term, evacuated the children. No one was injured, but the school was gutted. The roof collapsed. The stove survived because iron does not care about the building around it, but everything else, desks, books, slates, the piano. Mrs. Aldrich had shipped from Minnesota, was gone. 14 children and their teacher now had nowhere to go. The church, a small frame building 200 yards from the school, had a cook stove, but no adequate heating for the number of people who would need to use it. The cook stove could warm the area immediately around it, but the church was larger than any cabin in the district, and the walls were thin, and the cold spell was not ending. Ada arrived at the church within 3 hours of the fire, driving Martin's wagon loaded with brick from the creamery salvage pile and a sack of dry sand from her covered drying shed. Warren met her there. So did Pratt. So did Aldrich and Bergstrom and Coe and Hester Lund. The fire had done what Pike's influence could not undo. It had made the community's heating problem visible and immediate and shared. Ada walked the church interior. The cook stove sat near the east wall, its chimney rising through the roof. The seating, wooden benches, filled the center. The floor was plank over packed earth. The walls were single board with minimal chinking. She turned to Pratt. The cook stove stays where it is. We route part of its exhaust through a low bench along the south wall before returning it to the chimney. One short masonry pass, 12 to 15 feet of bench, 18 inches wide, enough for the youngest children to sit against. That is 2 days of work at minimum, Pratt said. The mortar needs to cure. You cannot fire it wet. I know. We heat the church with portable stones for the first 2 days. Heated field stones, wrapped in cloth, placed in boxes along the benches. We rotate them, heat a batch on the cook stove and the outdoor fire, deliver them warm, collect them cold, reheat. It is labor intensive, but it keeps the space above freezing while the bench cures. And on the third day? Low fires only, inspection at every joint. We post 2 adults on continuous smoke watch for the first 3 nights. Warren spoke from the doorway. If you fire uncured masonry, the steam from the wet mortar can blow a joint open under heat pressure. I have seen it in bread ovens. I know, Ada said. That is why we use heated stones first, and do not fire the bench until the mortar has dried. We test every joint before any child sits beside it. Warren looked at her. He had come to argue against the plan, and she had addressed his objection before he finished stating it. The adjustment was not a retreat. It was the adaptation of a builder who understood the limits of her materials and respected them. What do you need? Warren asked. Brick, sand, flat stone for the channel roof, 3 people who can mix mortar and 2 who can lift slabs, and someone to manage the heated stone rotation for the first 48 hours. I will manage the stones, Warren said. Pratt? Pratt looked at the cook stove, the chimney, the wall where the bench would run. He was calculating clearances, draft effects, load on the floor, proximity to seating. He was thinking like a stove installer, which meant he was thinking about everything that could go wrong. The chimney is marginal, he said. If you add 12 feet of horizontal resistance to the exhaust path, the draft may drop below functional. The cook stove was not designed for this kind of back pressure. Then we keep the bypass valve open only when the stove is burning hot. During low burn or overnight banking, the gases go straight up the chimney as before. The bench charges only during peak firing. Pratt nodded. Not eagerly, not with enthusiasm, with the careful, grudging approval of a professional who had found the plan technically sound, even though he would have preferred a simpler solution. I will bring chimney supplies from my shop, he said, and I want to inspect every joint personally before any fire is lit. Agreed. If Ada's story reminds you why shared knowledge matters more than hoarded advantage, pass this video to someone who believes preparation should belong to everyone. The build took 46 hours. Ada directed the construction. Pratt supervised the chimney connection. Warren hauled stone and managed the heated rock rotation that kept the church above freezing while the work continued. Bergstrom mixed mortar. Coe carried water and sand. Hester Lund organized the school-aged children into teams that ferried warm stones from the outdoor fire to cloth-wrapped boxes along the benches and carried cold stones back. The mortar cured unevenly. Ada inspected every joint twice, once on the first evening and once on the second morning. She found 2 weak spots where the mortar had dried too fast in the draft from the cook stove. She chipped them out and repacked them with a wetter mix that Matvey had shown her for fast-drying conditions. On the third morning, she lit the first test fire in the bypass channel. Low flames, minimal fuel. Every adult in the building watched a different section of the bench for smoke. No smoke appeared. She increased the fuel. The bench surface warmed. The children, who had been sitting on cold wooden benches wrapped in every coat and blanket their families owned, migrated toward the masonry wall like iron filings toward a magnet. One girl, Hester Lunn's youngest, 8 years old, pressed her back against the warm stone and closed her eyes. The expression on her face was the expression of someone who has been cold for 3 days and has stopped believing in warmth and then feels it again. Ada watched the girl for a moment. Then she checked the bypass valve, confirmed the draft, and moved on. Pike's reaction arrived 2 days after the church installation was complete. He did not come to the church. He filed a written complaint with the county clerk, claiming that Ada Voss had performed unlicensed construction on a public building, creating a fire hazard that endangered the lives of children. He requested that the installation be inspected by a qualified authority, and if found deficient, removed at the builder's expense. The complaint was not baseless. Ada had no construction license. Such licenses were rare and informal in Dakota Territory, but the precedent existed. The school fire had been caused by a chimney failure, and Pike could argue that installing another chimney-connected heating system in the replacement building invited the same disaster. Pratt testified. He did so at the county clerk's office in Miller, in front of Pike and 2 other businessmen, and he did so with the thermometer he had used in Ada's cabin 3 weeks earlier. I inspected every joint in the church installation, Pratt said. I tested the draft at the bypass valve. I measured the chimney clearance and the distance between the bench surface and the nearest combustible material. The bench meets or exceeds every standard I apply to my own stove installations. The bypass valve allows the cook stove to operate normally when the bench is not in use. The fired masonry is structurally sound. He paused. Mrs. Voss's staged firing procedure, using heated portable stones before lighting the bench itself, was safer than the method I would have recommended, which was to fire the bench immediately and monitor for problems. She chose the slower, more cautious approach. The children were never exposed to an untested system. Pike looked at Pratt. The look carried betrayal. Pratt had been the man who called Ada's platform a coffin. He had been the authority skeptic, the voice of professional experience, dismissing an amateur's improvisation. For Pike, Pratt's testimony was not merely unhelpful, it was a defection. The school burned because of a chimney failure, Pike said. You are now endorsing a chimney modification built by a woman with no credentials. I am endorsing a chimney modification that I personally inspected and found sound, Pratt said. My credentials are the endorsement, not hers. The complaint was not pursued. The clerk filed it and took no action. The bench remained. Pike's authority in the district did not collapse on that day. Authority built over 20 years does not collapse in an afternoon, but it cracked. The crack ran through the same place all such cracks run, the place where a man's stated concern for the community diverges from his actual concern for his own position, and other people notice the gap. A freight train stalled outside Miller on a Tuesday evening in late February. The locomotive's water supply froze in the tender. The engineer stopped the train on the main line 2 miles west of town and sent the firemen walking east for help. 23 passengers sat in 2 unheated cars as the temperature dropped below zero. Word reached Miller within the hour. The passengers were moved into town by wagon and sleigh. The hotel had 6 rooms. The church had the warming bench. 3 homes with masonry modifications offered floor space. But 23 people, plus their luggage, plus the train crew, exceeded every available warm room in a town of 400. Ada organized the distribution. She did not appoint herself. She was asked by Lila Aldrich and by the church deacon because she was the person who understood which rooms could hold heat and which could not. Children and elderly passengers went to the warmest masonry supplemented rooms. Families stayed together. Single men took the hotel and the church. The warming bench in the church ran continuously under supervision, charged by the cook stove bypass every 3 hours. Warren drove a wagon between the ranch and the town, carrying brush, straw, and split cottonwood from his outbuildings. Pratt, without being asked, rigged a temporary brick heat wall beside the warehouse stove in the building he used as a workshop. He directed the stove's exhaust through a single pass of salvaged brick, crude, unplastered, temporary, that radiated enough heat to keep 3 passengers warm through the night. The system held, not perfectly, not comfortably. 2 passengers complained about the cold. 1 child developed a cough, but no one froze. No one was turned away. The town, which 3 weeks earlier had laughed at a widow filling her cabin with sand, now ran on the principle she had fought to prove: mass holds heat, and heat shared is heat multiplied. Pike owned the largest brick warehouse in Miller. It was unheated, or rather, it was heated by a single iron stove that could not begin to warm the 1,200 square foot interior. During the train crisis, his water pipes froze. The frozen water expanded. The pipes burst. The burst flooded the floor and destroyed cases of bottled goods, sealed tins, and paper-wrapped dry goods that had been stacked directly on the ground. Pike stood in his warehouse and looked at the damage. He looked at the worthless iron stove squatting in the center of the room, pouring heat into a chimney that carried it away as fast as the fire could produce it. Then he sent a boy to find Ada Voss. Ada arrived and walked the warehouse. She did not gloat. She did not remind Pike of the things he had said about her, the credit he had frozen, the blacksmith he had pressured, the rumors he had spread. She walked the building, assessed the stove, the chimney, the floor, the walls, and the locations of the burst pipes. "You need thermal mass along the north wall," she said. "A brick heat wall, similar to what Pratt built in his shop. Your stove exhaust passes through it before reaching the chimney. The wall absorbs heat during the day and radiates it at night. Your pipes will not freeze if the interior stays above 32 degrees. How long to build? 3 days. 2 if you supply labor and brick." Pike looked at her. The calculation in his eyes was different now. He was not calculating how to acquire her property or undermine her influence. He was calculating the cost of another winter of burst pipes against the cost of admitting that Ada Voss had been right. "Use every brick I own," Pike said. "Just keep the room above freezing." "Then open the door first," Ada said. Pike looked at her. "The passengers, the ones still in the hotel and the church. Your warehouse is the largest enclosed space in town. With a heat wall and your stove, it could hold 10 people overnight. Open the door and let them in." Pike stood in his own warehouse, surrounded by the wreckage of his burst pipes and his spoiled inventory, and looked at a woman who held his comfort in her hands and was asking him to share his building before she would fix it. "Open it," he said. Ada began marking the north wall for the heat wall foundation. Chunk 4 continues. The heat wall in Pike's warehouse took 2.5 days. Ada built it with Pratt's help and the labor of 2 men Pike hired from the rail crew who were waiting for the locomotive's tender to thaw and had nothing else to do. The wall ran 18 feet along the north interior, 3 feet high, 2 feet thick, a mass of salvaged brick, field stone rubble, and dry sand packed between 2 masonry faces. Pike's stove exhaust entered the wall through a bypass valve at the east end, traveled through a broad flue channel, and exited at the west end into the existing chimney. The design was Ada's simplest yet. No sleeping surface, no firebox, no expansion joints or cleanout ports, just a thick wall of thermal mass that absorbed heat from the stove's exhaust and radiated it outward for hours after the fire died. It was the principle reduced to its most basic form. Stone remembers heat. The warehouse stove, which had previously heated a circle of air 12 feet in diameter and sent everything else up the chimney, now also charged 18 feet of brick wall that continued warming the building through the night. The passengers sheltered in Pike's warehouse for 2 nights before the train departed. None of them knew Ada's name. They knew only that the building was warm and that the warmth came from the wall, and that the woman who had built the wall spoke quietly and checked the chimney draft every 4 hours. Pike did not thank her. Ada did not expect him to. What she expected and what she received was something more durable than gratitude. Pike stopped working against her. He did not become an ally. He did not promote her designs or recommend her services, but the active obstruction, the credit manipulation, the freight restrictions, the whispered campaign ceased. Pike had asked for her help, and she had given it on the condition that he open his building. He had opened it. The transaction was complete, and both of them understood that the balance of power in the district had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by gossip. The heat wall remained in Pike's warehouse for 11 years. Warren Vale did not propose to Ada Voss after the blizzard. He did not propose after the church installation, or after the train crisis, or after the warehouse build. He did not propose at all in the traditional sense, the sense that involved a man choosing a moment of sufficient romance and speaking a prepared declaration. What happened instead was slower and less dramatic and more honest than any proposal. Warren came to Ada's cabin to check the chimney collar after a windstorm. He stayed to help her repack an expansion joint that had loosened during frost heave. She asked him to haul sand for the Bergstrom bench extension. He asked her to examine a cracked flue pipe in his ranch house. She rode 6 miles west. She found the crack and patched it with clay and ash mortar while Warren held the lantern. They ate supper at his table that evening. The meal was beans, salt pork, bread that Ada had brought from her own oven, and coffee that Warren brewed too strong. They talked about chimney clearances and sand drying methods, and the difficulty of finding sound brick in a district where most of the early construction had used the cheapest materials available. It was not a romantic conversation. It was the conversation of 2 people who had discovered that they thought about the same problems and arrived at compatible solutions and did not exhaust each other's patience during the process. Warren came to Ada's cabin the following week to repair a stable door hinge. He stayed to help her fire the platform and test a new mortar formula she was developing, one that used crushed limestone to increase heat resistance at the firebox joints. She cooked. He washed the dishes. They argued about whether the chimney on the Lund installation needed additional insulation. Ada said yes. Warren said the existing double pipe was sufficient. They settled it by riding to the Lund cabin together and inspecting the chimney, and Ada was right. Condensation had formed between the pipes where the sand packing had settled, and Warren said nothing, which was his way of conceding a point. They married in autumn of 1889. The courtship, if it could be called that, lasted 9 months and consisted almost entirely of shared labor. They hauled sand together. They inspected chimneys together. They disagreed about construction methods and resolved the disagreements by building test sections and measuring the results. Warren learned to test draft with a candle. Ada learned to judge a horse's condition by the sound of its breathing. They taught each other the things they knew and discovered in the teaching, that they trusted each other's competence more than they trusted anyone else's. Warren's marriage gift was not a ring or a dress or a piece of furniture. It was a covered outdoor sand-drying shed, a timber-framed structure with a sloped roof, open on the south side for airflow with canvas curtains that could be dropped during rain or snow. The shed could dry 800 pounds of sand in 3 days, quadrupling Ada's drying capacity and eliminating the weather delays that had nearly destroyed her schedule during construction. Ada looked at the shed and understood what it meant. Not the lumber or the labor, the meaning. Warren had built a tool for her work, not a decoration for her life, not a comfort for her home. A tool, a piece of infrastructure that said, "Your work continues, and I intend to be part of it." She hung Matvey's mason's hammer inside the shed, beside her measuring cord, and the two tools occupied the wall the way they occupied her mind, close together, each necessary, each serving a different purpose. By the early 1890s, Ada and Pratt maintained what amounted to a small workshop. It was not a formal business. Ada refused to charge for design consultations or safety inspections. She believed that the knowledge should be free, that a family's survival should not depend on whether they could afford an expert. But the hardware was another matter. Clean outdoors, firebox plates, chimney collars, and bypass valves required iron, and iron cost money, and the materials had to be purchased or fabricated. Pratt handled the metalwork. His shop produced standardized components, hinged, clean outdoors, sized to fit the bench designs Ada had developed, iron collar clamps for chimney connections, bypass valve plates with adjustable openings. He sold these at cost plus labor. He did not profit substantially, but the work kept his shop occupied during winter months when new stove installations slowed, and it gave him a role in the district's heating evolution that preserved his professional standing. Ada produced the rest. She drew safety diagrams, careful, specific illustrations showing firebox placement, flue paths, chimney clearances, expansion gaps, and clean-out locations. She drew 3 standard versions: the warming bench supplement, the sleeping platform, and the schoolhouse bench. Each diagram included a list of materials, a list of tools, and a list of things that would kill you if you ignored them. She posted the diagrams at the schoolhouse. She gave copies to anyone who asked. She drew personalized versions for families whose cabins required modifications to the standard designs. Pratt objected to the free distribution, not because he was greedy, but because he was cautious. If a man builds a bench from your diagram and the bench fails, you are responsible, Pratt said. If you charge a fee, you can inspect the work. If you give it away, you have no control over how it is built. I have no control either way, Ada said. A man who pays me can still ignore my advice. A man who gets the diagram free can still follow it perfectly. The diagram is the same. The fee changes nothing except who can afford to try. Pratt did not argue further. He understood Ada's position even when he disagreed with it. She was not building a business. She was building a practice, a set of shared habits that would outlast her own involvement. If the knowledge spread widely enough, it would correct itself. The families who built well would teach their neighbors. The families who built poorly would learn from the consequences. The knowledge would survive because it worked, not because someone controlled it. By 1892, approximately 30 households in the district had adopted some form of masonry warming modification. Not all used sand. Some used brick rubble alone. Some used clay and fieldstone. Some used combinations that Ada had not designed and would not have recommended, but that worked well enough in their specific buildings because the families understood the principles: draft, clearance, thermal mass, clean-out discipline, and applied them to their own conditions. The strongest legacy detail was not the platforms or the benches. It was the schoolhouse rule. After the fire that destroyed the original school, the rebuilt schoolhouse included a properly insulated chimney with adequate clearance, a warming bench along one wall, and a new requirement. Every older pupil would learn to test chimney draft with a candle before winter. The test became a ritual, performed each October before the first cold snap by children who understood why creosote accumulated and what happened when it ignited. Lila Aldrich administered the test each year. She kept the candle stub and the down feather in a tin box on her desk, beside the bell and the attendance register. The children called it the fire lesson. It took 15 minutes. It may have saved more lives than any heating system Ada ever built. Ada received Matvei's letter in the spring of 1890. It arrived in a brown envelope with no return address, postmarked Yankton. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a corrected chimney sketch, a modification to the double pipe insulation design that added a rain cap with an offset opening, preventing wind-driven precipitation from entering the sand layer between the pipes. The sketch was precise, drawn with a steady hand and annotated in Matvei's small, angular script. No personal message accompanied it, no greeting, no farewell. Just the drawing and, in the bottom corner, the letters MK. Ada studied the sketch, modified Hester Lund's chimney accordingly, and filed the original in the tin box where she kept her diagrams. 7 months later, a letter arrived from Matvei's niece in Yankton. Matvei Korda had died in August of 1890. The cause was lung disease, chronic damage from decades of exposure to kiln dust, brick particulate, and combustion smoke. He had been 59 years old. He had spent his final months in a chair beside a window, looking out at the Missouri River, occasionally sketching chimney modifications on scraps of paper that his niece found after his death and did not understand. Ada read the letter at the kitchen table, in the cabin that Matvei had helped her save, beside the platform that held his mortar formula in every joint. She did not cry. She had spent whatever tears she had for Matvei on the day he walked away down the track toward Miller, growing small against the white prairie. She hung the mason's hammer on a nail beside her measuring cord in the drying shed, where it had hung since the wedding. She looked at it, the worn face, the chipped peen, the short handle smoothed by decades of grip, a tool that had built culverts and kilns and chimney joints, and one heated platform in a board cabin 12 miles from a town that had laughed at the woman who needed it. She tapped the handle with her finger. It did not ring. Wood does not ring, but she heard it anyway. The clear tone of a sound brick, the dull tone of a cracked one, and the silence between them where judgment lived. Ada and Warren raised 2 children on the original claim, a son born in 1891 and a daughter born in 1893. The son had Martin's jaw and Ada's hands. The daughter had Warren's quiet and Ada's stubbornness, which meant she rarely spoke and never retreated. The ranch grew. Warren's horses were known across 3 counties. Ada's heating consultations extended beyond the immediate district. Families from Han County, Hyde County, and Buffalo County occasionally appeared at her cabin with questions about chimney draft, fuel consumption, or the feasibility of a masonry modification in their specific building. She answered every question. She drew diagrams on brown paper and gave them away. She refused payment and accepted occasionally eggs, cured meat, or a promise of labor during haying season. The platform that had saved Ada's life during the 1888 blizzard operated for 17 years. Ada fired it every winter, 2 firings a day during cold spells, 1 during mild weather. She cleaned the flue channels every autumn. She inspected the mortar joints with a candle each October, performing the same test she taught the school children. She replaced the surface plaster twice and repointed 3 joints where thermal cycling had opened hairline cracks. In 1905, Ada and Warren expanded the cabin into a proper ranch house. The expansion required removing the original platform. Warren pulled the timber curb first, then the surface slabs, then shoveled the sand into the drying shed for reuse. When they reached the inner masonry, the flue channels, the firebox base, the foundation piers, they found everything intact. The mortar was hard. The brick was sound. The stone had not shifted. The timber that had formed the outer curb, cottonwood planks that had sat within inches of the hot masonry for 17 years, showed no charring, no scorch marks, no heat damage of any kind. The independent stone foundation had kept the thermal mass separated from the wood, and the expansion joints had absorbed every cycle of heating and cooling without transmitting destructive force to the surrounding structure. Pratt, who was 78 and largely retired, came to see the dismantled platform at Ada's invitation. He examined the timber, the mortar, the bricks. He held a plank to the light and turned it, looking for darkening. 17 years, he said. 17 winters, Ada said. Pratt set the plank down. He looked at Ada. 50 years old now, her hair beginning to gray, her left wrist still wrapped when the weather turned cold, and he nodded once. It was the same nod he had given her when she defined the limits of her own invention more precisely than he would have. The nod of a professional who had lived long enough to see his original judgment overturned by evidence he could hold in his hands. "I was wrong about the timber," he said. "I thought the heat would find it eventually. The foundation prevented that." "Matvey's foundation," Ada said. "Matvey's foundation, your mortar, your maintenance." He paused. "My collar clamp." Ada smiled. It may have been the first time Pratt saw her smile. He returned it briefly and left. Ada kept one slab from the dismantled platform. It was a flat, smoke-darkened piece of fieldstone, roughly 18 inches square, that had formed part of the flue channel roof. The stone had absorbed and released heat thousands of times. Its surface was smooth and warm-toned, darkened by years of conducted warmth rather than direct flame. She placed it in the new kitchen as a bread shelf. Orson Pike lived in Miller until 1902. The credit panic of the early 1890s weakened his position. A series of drought years reduced the district's agricultural output, and the homesteaders who owed Pike money could not repay debts they had incurred during better times. Pike foreclosed on 6 properties. Each foreclosure was legal. Each was also noticed. The community's tolerance for Pike's method of accumulation, which had always been grudging, eroded with each family that lost its claim. Pike did not leave Miller in disgrace. He left because his business model required a growing population of indebted settlers, and the population was no longer growing. He sold his store, his warehouse, and his remaining liens to a buyer from Sioux Falls and moved east. The heat wall Ada had built in his warehouse remained standing when the new owner took possession. The new owner, a man named Garrett who knew nothing about thermal mass, assumed the wall was structural and left it in place. It continued functioning for years, warming the warehouse interior through winter nights, preventing the pipe freezes that had destroyed Pike's inventory. And Garrett never knew that the wall's warmth was the residue of a battle fought between a widow and a merchant over who would control the district's future. Pike never returned to Miller. He never publicly acknowledged Ada's contribution to the district's survival. But the last act of his time in the community, opening his warehouse during the train crisis because Ada required it, became the story people remembered. Not the liens, not the foreclosures, not the whispered campaigns. The door, the moment he opened it. It was not forgiveness. It was not redemption. It was the smallest possible capitulation of a man who had spent 20 years building power and discovered in a single evening that power without warmth was a building with burst pipes. Ada Voss Vale lived on the original claim until her death. The claim that had been 160 acres of wind-blasted tableland when Martin filed it became, under Ada and Warren's work, a working horse ranch with improved buildings, a covered sand-drying operation, and a small workshop where Pratt's standardized heating components were stored and distributed. Warren died in 1912, thrown from a horse during a spring roundup. He was 57. Ada buried him on the claim, beside Martin, beneath a stone that Warren had hauled from the creek terrace years earlier for a purpose he never specified and Ada never asked about. She continued the ranch with her son's help, She continued the heating consultations alone. She continued cleaning her own chimney every autumn, testing the draft with a candle, inspecting the joints of the new masonry stove that had replaced the original platform in the expanded house. In her later years, she was known less for a single invention than for a way of thinking. She had not created the principle of thermal mass. The Chinese had built heated sleeping platforms for centuries. The Koreans had warmed floors with channeled heat for longer than that. European masonry stoves had stored warmth in brick and tile for generations. What Ada had done, what Matvey had taught her, and she had taught others, was translate the principle into a practice that fit the specific conditions of the northern plains. Limited fuel, limited money, limited materials, unlimited cold, and the urgent, pressing need to keep people alive with what was at hand rather than what could be ordered from a catalog. She taught her daughter to test chimney draft. She taught her granddaughter to mix mortar from subsoil, sharp sand, and chopped dry grass. She told neither of them that she had invented anything. She told them that she had learned from a man named Matvey Korda, who had learned from other men, who had learned from other men before them, and that the knowledge was old, and the only thing new about it was the specific shape it took when it arrived in a specific place and was needed by a specific person. The granddaughter, born in 1910, would remember two things about her grandmother. The first was the sound of the mason's hammer tapping stone, a clear ring for good, a dull thud for bad. The second was the warmth of the bread shelf in the kitchen, where a dark stone radiated a faint, persistent heat that seemed to come from inside the rock itself, rather than from the stove nearby. She asked Ada about it once. Ada placed the girl's small palm against the stone and said, "Feel that. The stove warms the air. The stone remembers the warmth. The air forgets by morning. The stone does not." The girl did not understand the principle. She understood the sensation, warmth coming from something solid, warmth that did not flicker or fade the way firelight faded, warmth that simply was, patient and residual and still present when everything else had cooled. In the district around Miller, 37 households eventually adopted some form of Ada's heat storage design. Not every version contained sand. Some used brick rubble, clay, fieldstone, or combinations adapted to local foundations and chimneys. The strongest legacy was the schoolhouse rule, every older pupil learning to test chimney draft with a candle before winter, a ritual that continued for 2 generations past Ada's lifetime and likely prevented more fires than any building code the territory ever adopted. Ada died on the claim in 1924, at 65. She was buried beside Warren and Martin beneath the creek terrace stone. Her daughter found the mason's hammer hanging in the drying shed and placed it on the kitchen shelf beside the dark fieldstone bread slab. The two objects sat together for years, the hammer and the stone, the tool and the material, the teacher's gift, and the student's proof. On the night of January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped below 30 degrees below zero across Dakota Territory. Wind drove snow horizontally at speeds that buried fences and collapsed roofs, and turned the open prairie into a killing field that no amount of firewood could have defeated by flame alone. Gideon Pratt, who had installed iron stoves across 3 counties and understood heat the way a surgeon understands bone, looked at a widow with $9 and less than a quart of fuel and said she was building herself a coffin and paying extra to warm it. It had not made the storm harmless. Frost still formed on the ceiling nails. Water still froze against the north wall. Ada burned the last of Martin's fence rails before dawn. The cabin's far corners stayed cold enough to skin ice on a pail, and the chimney collar came loose in the night, and she fixed it with the last piece of wire she owned, while a man who had come to carry her corpse lay on the platform behind her, wrapped in the blanket he had brought for the dead. But the bed beneath her had held what the flames would otherwise have carried up the chimney, and the bread had risen, and the stone had remembered. Years later, Ada pressed dough beneath a cloth, while her granddaughter placed a palm near the old bread shelf. Ada picked up Matvei's hammer, tapped the dark stone, and listened for the clear ring. Outside, the prairie took the fire away. Inside, the stone remembered it.